Chapter 13 of The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A double game and its consequences. I went to the railway station, and from the timetable gathered that if I left Abo by rail at noon, I could be in Petersburg an hour before noon on the morrow, or about 4 hours before the arrival of the steamer by which the silent girl and her companion were passengers. This I decided upon doing, but before leaving I paid a visit to my friend Boransky, who, to my surprise and delight, handed me my wallet with the Czar's letter intact, saying that it had been found upon a German thief who had been arrested at the harbor on the previous night. The fellow had, no doubt, stolen it from my pocket, believing I carried my paper money in the flap. "The affair of the English lady is a most extraordinary one," remarked the Chief of Police, toying with his pen as he sat at his big table. "She seems to have met this Englishman up at Tammerfors, or at some place further north. Yet it is curious that her passport should be in order even though she fled so precipitately from Cayana. There is a mystery connected with her disappearance from the woodcutter's hut that I confess I cannot fathom." "Neither can I said. "I know the man who is with her, and cannot help fearing that he is her bitterest enemy, that he is acting in concert with the Baron." "Then why is he taking her to the capital, beyond the jurisdiction of the Governor-General?" "I am going straight to Petersburg to ascertain," I said. "I have only come to thank you for your kindness in this matter. Truth to tell, I have been somewhat surprised that you should have interested yourself on my behalf," I added, looking straight at the uniformed official. "It was not on yours, but on hers," he answered, somewhat enigmatically. "I know something of the affair, but it was my duty as a man to help the poor girl to escape from that terrible place. She has, I know, been unjustly condemned for the attempted assassination of the wife of a general. Condemned with a purpose, of course. Such a thing is not unusual in Finland." "Abominable!" I cried. "Oberg is a veritable fiend." But the man only shrugged his shoulders, saying, "The orders of His Excellency the Governor-General have to be obeyed whatever they are. We often regret, but we dare not refuse to carry them out." "Russian rule is a disgrace to our modern civilization," I declared hotly. "I have every sympathy with those who are fighting for freedom." "Ah, you are not alone in that," he sighed, speaking in a low whisper and glancing around. "His Majesty would order reforms and ameliorate the condition of his people if only it were possible. But he, like his officials, are powerless. Here we speak of the great uprising with bated breath, but we, alas, know that it must come one day, very soon, and Finland will be the first to endeavor to break her bonds, and the Baron Oberg the first to fall." For nearly an hour I sat with him, surprised to find how, although his exterior was so harsh and uncouth, yet his heart really bled for the poor starving people he was so constantly forced to oppress. "I have ruined this town of Abo," he declared quite frankly. "To my own knowledge 500 innocent persons have gone to prison, and another 200 have been exiled to Siberia. Yet what I have done is only at direct orders from Helsingfors, orders that are stern, pitiless, and unjust. Men have been torn from their families and sent to the mines. Women have been arrested for no offense and shipped off to Sakhalin, and mere children have been cast into prison on charges of political conspiracy with their elders, in order to Russify the province. Only," he added anxiously, "I trust you will never repeat what I tell you. You have asked me why I assisted the English mademoiselle to escape from Cayana, and I have explained the reason." We ate a hearty meal in company at the Sampalinna, a restaurant built like a Swiss chalet, and at noon I entered the train on the first stage of my slow, tedious journey through the great silent forests and along the shores of the lakes of southern Finland by way of Tavestus and Viborg to Petersburg. I was alone in the compartment and sat moodily watching the panorama of wood and river as we slowly wound up the tortuous ascents and descended the steep gradients. I had not even a newspaper with which to while away the time, only my own apprehensive thoughts of whither my helpless love was being conducted. Surely to no man was there ever presented such a complicated problem as that which I was now trying so vigorously to solve. I loved Elma Heath. The more I reflected, the deeper did her sweet countenance and tender grace impress themselves upon my heart. I loved her, therefore I was striving to overtake her. The steamer, I learned, would call at Hango and Helsingfors. Would they, I wonder, disembark at either of those places? Was the man whom I had known as Hornby, the owner of the Lola, taking her to place her again in the fiendish hands of Xavier Oberg? The very thought of it caused me to hold my breath. Daylight came at last, cold and grey, over those dreary interminable marshes where game, especially snipe, seemed abundant, and at a small station at the head of a lake called Davidstadt, I took my morning glass of tea. Then we resumed our journey down to Viborg, where a short, thick Russian of the commercial class, but something of a dandy, entered my compartment, and we left express for Petersburg. We had passed by a small station called Galitsina, near which were many villas occupied in summer by families from Petersburg, and were traveling through the dense, gloomy pine woods when my fellow traveler, having asked permission to smoke, commenced to chat affably. He seemed a pleasant fellow, and told me that he was a wool merchant, and that he had been having a pleasant vacation trout fishing in the Vorski above the falls of the Imatra, where the pools between the rapids abounded with fish. He had told me that on account of the shore being so full of weeds and the clearness of the water, fishing from the banks was almost an impossibility, and how they had to accustom themselves to troll from a boat so small as to only accommodate the rower and the fisherman. Then he remarked suddenly, "You are English, I presume, possibly from Helsingfors?" "No," I answered, "from Abo. I crossed from Stockholm and am going to Petersburg." "And I also. I live in Petersburg," he added. "We may perhaps meet one day. Do you know the capital?" I explained that I had visited it once before, and had done the usual round of sightseeing. His manner was brisk and to the point, as became a man of business, but when we stopped at Bela Ostrov, on the opposite side of the small winding river that separates Finland from Russia proper, the customs officer who came to examine our baggage exchanged a curious meaning look with him. My fellow traveler believed that I had not observed, yet keenly on the alert as I now was, I was shrewd to detect the least sign or look, and I at once resolved to tell the fellow nothing further of my own affairs. He was, no doubt, a spy of the Stranglers, who had followed me all the way from Abo, and had only entered my carriage for the final stage of the journey. This revelation caused me some uneasiness, for even though I was able to evade the man on arrival in Petersburg, he could no doubt quickly obtain news of my whereabouts from the police to whom my passport must be sent. I pretended to doze, and lay back with my eyes half closed watching him. When he found me disinclined to talk further, he took up the paper which he had bought, and became engrossed in it, while I, on my part, endeavored to form some plan by which to mislead and escape his vigilance. The fellow meant mischief, that I knew. If Elma was flying in secret and he watched me, he would know that she was in Petersburg. At all hazards, for my love's sake as well as for mine, I saw that I must escape him. The ingenious and cleverness of Oberg's spies was proverbial throughout Finland. Therefore he might not be alone, or in any case, on arrival in Petersburg, would obtain assistance in keeping observation upon me. I knew that the Baron desired my death, and that therefore I could not be too wary of pitfalls. That fatal chair so cunningly prepared for me in Lambeth was still vividly within my memory. As we passed Lanskaya and ran through the outer suburbs of Petersburg, my fellow traveler became inquisitive as to where I was going. but I was somewhat unresponsive, and busied myself with my bag until we entered the great echoing terminus, where I could see the Neva gleaming in the pale sunlight and the city beyond. The fellow made no attempt to follow me. He was too clever a secret agent for that. He merely wished me "Zdravstvuyte," raised his hat politely, and disappeared. A porter carried my bag out of the station, and I drove across the bridge to the large hotel where I had stopped before, on the corner of the Nevsky Prospect and the Michael Street. There I engaged a front room looking down into the broad Nevsky, had a wash, and then watched at the window for the appearance of the spy. I had already a good 4 hours before the steamer from Abo was due, and I intended to satisfy myself whether or not I was being followed. Within 20 minutes the fellow lounged along on the opposite side of the road, just as I had expected. He had changed his clothes and presented such a different appearance that at first sight I failed to recognize him. He knew that I had driven there, and intended to follow me if I came forth. My position was one of extreme difficulty, for if I went down to the quay he would most certainly follow me. Having watched his movements for 10 minutes or so, I descended to the big salle à manger, and there ate my luncheon, chatting to the French waiter the while. I sat purposely in an alcove so as to be away from the other people lunching there, and in order that I might be able to talk with the waiter without being overheard. Just as I had finished my meal and he was handing me my bill, I bent towards him and asked, "Do you want to earn 20 roubles?" "Well, monsieur," he answered, looking at me with some surprise, "they would be acceptable. I am a married man." "Well, I want to escape from this place without being observed. There is a disagreeable little matter regarding a lady, and I fear a fracas with a man who is awaiting me outside in the Nevsky." Then, seeing that he hesitated, I assured him that I had committed no crime, and that I should return for my baggage that evening. "You could pass through the kitchen and out by the servants' entrance," he said, after a moment's reflection. "If monsieur so desires, I will conduct him out. The exit is in a back street which leads on to the Catherine Canal." "Excellent," I said. "Let us go. Of course you will say nothing?" "Not a word, monsieur," and he gathered up the notes, plus 20 roubles, with which I paid my bill, and taking my hat I followed him to the end of the salle à manger, behind a high wooden screen, across the huge kitchen, and then through a long stone corridor, at the end of which sat a gruff old doorkeeper. My guide spoke a word to him, and then the door opened, and I found myself in a narrow back slum with the canal beyond. My first visit was to a clothier's, where I purchased and put on a new light overcoat, and then to a hatter's for a hat of a different shape to that which I was wearing. I carried the hat back to a quiet alley which I had noticed, and quickly exchanged the one I was wearing for it, leaving my old hat in a corner. Then I entered a café in order to while away the hours until the vessel from Finland was due. At 4 o'clock I was out upon the quay, straining my eyes seaward for any signs of smoke, but could see nothing. The sun was sinking, and the broad expanse of water westward danced like liquid gold. The light died out slowly, the cold gray of evening crept on. A chill wind sprang up and swept the quay, causing me to shiver. I asked of a dock laborer whether the steamer was usually late, whereupon he told me that it was often 5 or 6 hours behind time, depending upon the delay at Helsingfors. Twilight deepened into night, and the rain fell heavily, yet I still paced the wet flags in patience, my eyes ever seaward for the light of the vessel which I hoped bore my love. My presence there aroused some speculation among the loungers, I think. Nevertheless, I waited in deepest anxiety whether, after all, Elma and Hornby had not disembarked at Helsingfors. Soon after 10 o'clock a light shone afar off, and the movement of the police and porters on the quay told me that it was the vessel. Then after a further anxious quarter of an hour it came, amid great shouting and mutual imprecations, slowly alongside the quay, and the passengers at last began to disembark in the pelting rain. One after another they walked up the gangway, filing into the passport office and on into the custom house, people of all sorts and all grades, Swedes, Germans, Finns and Russians, until suddenly I caught sight of two figures, one a man in a big tweed travelling coat and a golf cap, and the other the slight figure of a woman in a long dark cloak and a woolen tam o' shanter. The electric rays fell upon them as they came up the wet gangway together, and there once again I saw the sweet face of the silent woman whom I had grown to love with such fervent desperation. The man behind her was the same who had entertained me on board the Lola, the man who was said to be the lover of the fugitive Muriel Leithcourt. Without betraying my presence, I watched them pass through the passport office and custom house, and then, overhearing the address which Martin Woodroffe gave the isvostchik, I stood aside, wet to the skin, and saw them drive away. At 11 o'clock on the following day, I found myself installed in the Hôtel de Paris, a comfortable hostelry in the Little Morskaya, having succeeded in evading the vigilance of the spy who had so cleverly followed me from Abo, and in getting my suit-case round from the Hôtel Europe. I was beneath the same roof as Elma, although she was in ignorance of my presence. Anxious to communicate with her without Woodroffe's knowledge, I was now awaiting my opportunity. He had, it appeared, taken for her a pleasant front room with a sitting room adjoining on the first floor, while he himself occupied a room on the third floor. The apartments he had engaged for her were the most expensive in the hotel, and as far as I could gather from the French waiter whom I judiciously tipped, he appeared to treat her with every consideration and kindness. "Ah, poor young lady!" the man exclaimed as he stood in my room answering my questions. "What an affliction! She writes down all her orders, for she can utter no word." "Has the Englishman received any visitors?" I asked. "One man, a Russian, an official of police, I think." "If he receives anyone else, let me know," I said, "and I want you to give Mademoiselle a letter from me in secret." "Bien, monsieur." I turned to the little writing table and scribbled a few hasty lines to my love, announcing my presence, and asking her to grant me an interview in secret as soon as Woodroffe was absent. I also warned her of the search for her instigated by the Baron, and urged her to send me a line in reply. The note was delivered into her hand, but although I waited in suspense nearly all day, she sent no reply. While Woodroffe was in the hotel, I dared not show myself, lest he should recognize me. Therefore I was compelled to sham indisposition and to eat my meals alone in my room. Both the means by which she had met Martin Woodroffe and the motive were equally an enigma. By that letter she had written to her schoolfellow, it was apparent that she had some secret of his, for had she not wished to send him a message of reassurance that she had divulged nothing? This would seem that they were close friends, yet on the other hand something seemed to tell me that he was acting falsely and was really an ally of the Baron's. Why had he brought her to Petersburg? If he had desired to rescue her, he would have taken her in the opposite direction, to Stockholm, where she would be free, whereas he took her, an escaped prisoner, into the very midst of peril. It was true that her passport was in order, yet I remembered that an order had been issued for her transportation to Sakhalin, and now, once arrested, she must be lost to me for ever. This thought filled me with fierce anxiety. She was in Petersburg, that city where police spies swarm, and where every fresh arrival is noted and his antecedents inquired into. No attempt had been made to disguise who she was, therefore before long the police would undoubtedly come and arrest her as the escaped criminal from Cayana. For several hours I sat at my window watching the life and movement down in the street below, my mind full of wonder and dark forebodings. Was Martin Woodroffe playing her false? Just after 6:30 the waiter entered, and handing me a note on a salver, said, "Mademoiselle has, I believe, only this moment been able to write in secret." I tore it open, and read as follows: "Dear friend, I am so surprised. I thought you were still in Abo. Woodroffe has an appointment at 8 o'clock on the other side of the city. Therefore come to me at 8:15. I must see you, and at once. I am in peril. Elma Heath." My love was in peril! It was just as I had feared. I thanked Providence that I had been sent to help her and extricate her from that awful fate to which the Strangler of Finland had consigned her. At the hour she named, after the waiter had come to me and announced the Englishman's departure, I descended to her sitting room and entered without rapping, for if I had rapped she could not, alas, have heard. The apartment was spacious and comfortable, thickly carpeted, with heavy furniture and gilding. Before the long window were drawn curtains of dark green plush, and on one side was the high stove of white porcelain with shining brass bands, while from her low lounge chair a slim wan figure sprang up quickly and came forward to greet me, holding out both her hands and smiling happily. I took her hands in mine and held them tightly in silence for some moments, as I looked earnestly into those wonderfully brilliant eyes of hers. She turned away, laughing, a slight flush rising to her cheeks at her confusion. Then she led me to a chair and motioned me to be seated. Ours was a silent meeting, but her gestures and the expression of her eyes were surely more eloquent than mere words. I knew well what pleasure that re-encounter caused her, equal pleasure with that it gave me. Until that moment I had never really loved. I had admired and flirted with women. What man has not? Indeed, I had admired Muriel Leithcourt, but never until now had I experienced in my heart the real flame of true burning affection. The sweetness of her expression, the tender caress of those soft, tapering hands, the deep, mysterious look in those magnificent eyes, and the incomparable grace of all her movements, combined to render her the most perfect woman I had ever met. Perfect in all, alas, save speech and hearing, of which, with such dastard wantonness, she had been deprived. She touched her red lips with the tip of her forefinger, opened her hands and shrugged her shoulders with a sad gesture of regret. Then turning quickly to some paper on the little table at her side, she wrote something with a gold pencil and handed it to me. It read: "Surely Providence has sent you here. Mr. Woodroffe must have followed you from England. He is my enemy. You must take me from here and hide me. They intend to send me into exile. Have you ever been in Petersburg before? Do you know anyone here?" Then, when I had read, she handed me her pencil, and below I wrote: "I will do my best, dear friend. I have been once in Petersburg, but is it not best that we should escape at once from Russia?" "Impossible at present," she wrote. "We should both be arrested at the frontier. It would be best to go into hiding here in Petersburg. I believed Woodroffe to be my friend, but I have found only this day that he is my enemy. He knew that I was in Kajana, and was in Abo when he learned of my escape. He went with 2 other men in search of us, and discovered us that night when we sought shelter at the woodcutter's hut. Without making his presence known, he waited outside until you were asleep, and then he came and looked in at my window. At first I was alarmed, but quickly I saw that he was a friend. He told me that the police were in the vicinity and intended to raid the hut. Therefore I fled with him, first down to Tammerfors, and then to Abo, and on here. At that time I did not see the dastardly trap he had laid in order to get me out of the Baron's clutches and wring from me my secret. If I confess, he intends to give me up to the police, who will send me to the mines." "Does your secret concern him?" I asked in writing. "Yes," she wrote in response. "It would be equally in his interests as well as those of Baron Oberg if I were sent to Saghalien and my identity effaced. I am a Russian subject, as I have already told you. Therefore, with the ministerial order against me, I am in deadliest peril." "Trust in me," I scribbled quickly. "I will act upon any suggestion you make. Have you any female friend in whom you could trust to hide you until this danger is past?" "There is one friend, a true friend. Will you take a note to her?" she wrote, to which I instantly nodded in the affirmative. Then rising, she obtained some ink and pen, and wrote a letter, the contents of which she did not show me before she sealed it. I sat watching her beautiful head bent beneath the shaded lamplight, catching her profile and noticing how eminently handsome it was, superb and unblemished in her youthful womanhood. I watched her write the superscription upon the envelope: "Madame Olga Stasulevitch, modiste, Skredny Prospect, 231, Vasily Ostrov." I knew that the district was on the opposite side of the city, close to the Little Neva. "Take a drosky at once, see her, and await a reply. In the meantime I will prepare to be ready when you return," she wrote. "If Olga is not at home, ask to see the Red Priest, in Russian Krasny Pastor. Return quickly, as I fear Woodroffe may come back. If so, I am lost." I assured her I would not lose a single instant, and 5 minutes later I was tearing down the Morskaya in a drosky along the canal and across the Nicholas Bridge to the address upon the envelope. The house was, I found, somewhat smaller than its neighbors, but not let out in flats as the others. Upon the door was a large brass plate bearing the name Olga Stasulevitch, Modes. I pressed the electric button, and in answer a tall, clean-shaven Russian servant opened the door. "Madame is not at home," was his brief reply to my inquiry. "Then I will see the Red Priest," I said in a lower tone. "I come from Elma Heath." Thereupon, without further word, the man admitted me into the long, dark hall, and closed the door with an apology that the gas was not lighted. But striking a match, he led me up the broad staircase and into a small, cosy, well-furnished room on the second floor, evidently the sitting-room of some studious person, judging from the books and critical reviews lying about. For a few minutes I waited there, until the door reopened, and there entered a man of medium height, with a shock of long, snow-white hair and an almost patriarchal beard, whose dark eyes that age had dimmed flashed out at me with a look of curious inquiry, and whose movements were those of a person not quite at his ease. "I have called on behalf of Mademoiselle Elma Heath to give this letter to Madame Stasulevitch, or, if she is absent, to place it in the hands of the Red Priest," I explained in my best Russian. "Very well, sir," the old man responded in quite good English. "I am the person you seek," and taking the letter he opened and read it through. I saw by the expression on his furrowed face that its contents caused him the utmost consternation. His countenance, already pale, blanched to the lips, while in his eyes there shot a fire of quick apprehension. The thin, almost transparent hand holding the letter trembled visibly. "You know Mademoiselle, eh?" he asked in a hoarse, strained voice as he turned to me. "You will help her to escape?" "I will risk my own life in order to save hers," I declared. "And your devotion to her is prompted by what?" he inquired suspiciously. I was silent for a moment. Then I confessed the truth. "My affection." "Ah!" he sighed deeply. "Poor young lady! She who has enemies on every hand sadly needs a friend. But can we trust you? Have you no fear?" "Of what?" "Of being implicated in the coming revolution in Russia? Remember, I am the Red Priest. Have you never heard of me? My name is Otto Kampf." Otto Kampf? I stood before him open-mouthed. Who in Russia had not heard of that mysterious unknown person who had directed 100 conspiracies against the imperial autocrat, and yet the identity of whom the police had always failed to discover? It was believed that Kampf had once been professor of chemistry at Moscow University, and that he had invented the most terrible and destructive explosive used by the revolutionists. The ingredients of the powerful compound and the mode of firing it was the secret of the Nihilists alone, and Otto Kampf, the mysterious leader whose personality was unknown even to the conspirators themselves, directed those constant attempts which held the Emperor and his government in such hourly terror. Rewards without number had been offered by the Ministry of the Interior for the betrayal and arrest of the unseen man whose power in Russia, permeating every class, was greater than that of the Emperor himself, at whose word one day the people would rise in a body and destroy their oppressors. The Emperor, the ministers, the police, and the bureaucrats knew this, yet they were powerless. They knew that the mysterious professor who had disappeared from Moscow 15 years before and had never since been seen was only waiting his opportunity to strike a blow that would stagger and crush the empire from end to end. Yet of his whereabouts they were in utter ignorance. "You are surprised," the old man laughed, noticing my amazement. "Well, you are not one of us. Yet I need not impress upon you the absolute necessity, for Mademoiselle's sake, to preserve the secret of my existence. It is because you are not a member of the will of the people that you have never heard of the Red Priest. Red, because I wrote my ultimatum to the Czar in the blood of one of his victims knouted in the fortress of Peter and Paul, and priest, because I preached the gospel of freedom and justice." "I shall say nothing," I said, gazing at the strangely striking figure before me, the unknown man who directed the great upheaval that was to revolutionize Russia. "My only desire is to save Mademoiselle Heath." "And you are prepared to do so at risk of your own liberty, your own life? Ah, you said you love her. Would not this be a test of your affection?" "I am prepared for any test, as long as she escapes the trap which her enemies have set for her. I succeeded in saving her from Cayana, and I intend to save her now." "Was it you who actually entered Cayana and snatched her from that tomb?" he exclaimed, and he took my hand enthusiastically, adding, "I have no further need to doubt you." And turning to the table, he wrote an address upon a slip of paper, saying, "Take Mademoiselle there. She will find a safe place of concealment. But go quickly, for every moment places you both in more deadly peril. Hide yourself there also." I thanked him and left at once, but as I stepped out of the house and re-entered the drosky, I saw close by, lurking in the shadow, the spy of the Strangler of Finland who had travelled with me from Abo. Our eyes met, and he recognized me, notwithstanding my light overcoat and new hat. Then, with heart sinking, the ghastly truth flashed upon me. All had been in vain. Elma was lost to me. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Her Highness is inquisitive. Instantly the danger was apparent, and instead of driving back to the hotel, I called out to the man to take me to the Moscow railway station in order to put the spy off the scent. I knew he would follow me, but as he was on foot with no drosky in sight, I should be able to reach the station before he could, and therefore elude him. Over the stones we rattled, leaving the lurking agent standing in the deep shadow, but on turning back I saw him dash across a road to a by-street, where, in all probability, he had a conveyance in waiting. Then, after we had crossed the Neva, I countermanded my order to the man, saying, "Don't go right up to the station. Turn into the Litinoy Prospect to the left, and put me down there. Drive quickly, and I'll pay double fare." He whipped his horses, and we turned into that maze of dark, ill-lit, narrow streets that lies between the Voznesensky and the Nevsky, turning and winding until we emerged at last into the main thoroughfare again. And then at last we turned into the street I had indicated, a wide road of handsome buildings where I knew I was certain to be able to instantly get another drosky. I flung the man his money, alighted, and 2 minutes later was driving on towards the Alexander Bridge, travelling in a circle back to the hotel. Time after time I glanced behind, but saw nothing of the Baron's spy, who had evidently gone to the station with all speed, expecting that I was leaving the capital. I found Elma in her room, ready dressed to go out, wearing a long travelling cloak, and in her hand was a small dressing case. She was pale and full of anxiety until I showed her the slip of paper which Otto Kampf had given me, with the address written upon it, and then together we hurried forth. The house to which we drove was, we discovered, a large one facing the Fontanka Canal, one of the best quarters of the town, and on descending I asked the liveried dvornik for Madame Zurloff, the name which the Red Priest had written. "You mean the Princess Zurloff," remarked the man through his red beard. "Whom shall I say desires to see her?" "Take that," I said, handing to him the piece of paper which, beside the address, bore a curious cipher mark like 3 triangles joined. He closed the door, leaving us in the wide carpeted hall, the statuary in which showed us that it was a richly furnished place, and when, a few minutes later, he returned, he conducted us upstairs to a fine gilded salon, where an elderly grey-haired lady in black stood gravely to receive us. "Allow me to present Mademoiselle Elma Heath, Princess," I said, speaking in French and bowing, and afterwards telling her my own name. Our hostess welcomed my love in a graceful speech, but I said, "Mademoiselle unfortunately suffers a terrible affliction. She is deaf and dumb." "Ah, how very, very sad!" she exclaimed sympathetically. "Poor girl, poor girl!" And she placed her hand tenderly upon Elma's shoulder and looked into her eyes. Then turning to me she said, "So the Red Priest has sent you both to me. You are in danger of arrest, I suppose? You wish me to conceal you here?" "I would only ask sanctuary for Mademoiselle," was my reply. "For myself I have no fear. I am English, and therefore not a member of the party." "The Mademoiselle fears arrest?" "There is an order signed for her banishment to Sakhalin," I said. "She was imprisoned at Kajana, the fortress away in Finland, but I succeeded in liberating her." "She has actually been in Kajana?" gasped the Princess. "Ah, we have all heard sufficient of the horrors of that place. And you liberated her! Why, she is the only person who has ever escaped from that living tomb to which Oberg sends his victims." "I believe so, Princess." "And may I take it, monsieur, that the reason you risked your life for her is because you love her? Pardon me for suggesting this." Then, knowing that Elma could not hear, I added, "I love her, but we are not lovers. I have not told her of my affection. Hers is a long and strange story, and she will perhaps tell you something of it in writing." "Well," exclaimed the grey-haired lady, smiling, leading my love across the luxurious room, the atmosphere of which was filled with the scent of flowers, and taking off her cloak with her own hands, "you are safe here, my poor child. If spies have not followed you, then you shall remain my guest as long as you desire." "I am sure it is very good of you, Princess," I said gratefully. "Miss Heath is the victim of a vile and dastardly conspiracy. When I tell you that she has been afflicted as she is by her enemies, that an operation was performed upon her in Italy while she was unconscious, you will readily see in what deadly peril she is." "What?" she cried. "Have her enemies actually done this? Horrible!" "She will perhaps tell you of the strange romance that surrounds her, a mystery which I have not yet been able to fathom. She is a Russian subject, although she has been educated in England. Baron Oberg himself is, I believe, her worst and most bitter enemy." "Ah, the Strangler!" she exclaimed, with a quick flash in her dark eyes. "But his end is near. The movement is active in Helsingfors. At any moment now we may strike our blow for freedom." She was an enthusiastic revolutionist, I could see, unsuspected, however, by the police on account of her high position in Petersburg society. It was she who, as I afterwards discovered, had furnished the large sums of money to Kampf for the continuation of the revolutionary propaganda, and indeed secretly devoted the greater part of her revenues from her vast estates in Samara and Kazan to the Nihilist cause. Her husband, himself an enthusiast of freedom, although of the high nobility, had been killed by a fall from his horse 6 years before, and since that time she had retired from society and lived there quietly, making the revolutionary movement her sole occupation. The authorities believed that her retirement was due to the painful loss she had sustained, and had no suspicion that it was her money that enabled the mysterious Red Priest to slowly but surely complete the plot for the general uprising. She compelled me to remove my coat, and tea was served by a Tartar footman, whose family, she explained, had been serfs of the Zurloffs for 3 centuries. And then Elma exchanged confidences with her by means of paper and pencil. "Who is this man Martin Woodroffe of whom she speaks?" asked the Princess presently, turning to me. "I have met him twice, only twice," I replied, "and under strange circumstances." Then continuing, I told her something concerning the incidents of the yacht Lola. "He may be in love with her and desires to force her into marriage," she suggested, expressing amazement at the curious narrative I had related. "I think not, for several reasons. One is because I know she holds some secret concerning him, and another because he is engaged to an English girl named Muriel Leithcourt." "Leithcourt? Leithcourt?" repeated the Princess, knitting her brows with a puzzled air. "Do you happen to know her father's name?" "Philip Leithcourt." "And has he actually been living in Scotland?" "Yes," I answered in quick anxiety. "He rented a shoot called Rannoch, near Dumfries. A mysterious incident occurred on his estate, a double murder, or murder and suicide, which is not quite clear. But shortly afterwards there appeared one evening at the house a man named Chater, Hilton Chater, and the whole family at once fled and disappeared." Princess Zurloff sat with her lips pressed close together, looking straight at the silent girl before her. Elma had removed her hat and cloak, and now sat in a deep easy-chair of yellow silk, with the lamplight shining on her chestnut hair, settled and calm as though already thoroughly at home. I smiled to myself as I thought of the chagrin of Woodroffe when he returned to find his victim missing. "Your Highness evidently knows the Leithcourts," I hazarded after a brief silence. "I have heard of them," was her unsatisfactory reply. "I go to England sometimes. When the Prince was alive we were often at Claridge's for the season. The Prince was for 5 years military attaché at the embassy under de Stael, you know. What I know of the Leithcourts is not to their credit. But you tell me that there was a mysterious incident before their flight. Explain it to me." At that moment the long white doors of the handsome salon were thrown open by the faithful Tartar servitor, and there entered a man whose hair fell over the collar of his heavy overcoat, but whom in an instant I recognized as Otto Kampf. Both Elma and I sprang to our feet, while advancing to the Princess he bent and gallantly kissed the hand she held forth to him. Then he shook hands with Elma, and acknowledging my own greetings, took off his coat and threw it upon a chair with the air of an accustomed visitor. "I come, Princess, in order to explain to you," he said. "Mademoiselle fears rearrest, and the only house in Petersburg that the police never suspect is this. Therefore I send her to you, knowing that with your generosity you will help her in her distress." "It is all arranged," was Her Highness's response. "She will remain here, poor girl, until it is safe for her to get out of Russia." Then, after some further conversation, and after my well-beloved had made signs of heartfelt gratitude to the man known from end to end of the Russian Empire as the Red Priest, the Princess turned to me, saying, I would much like to know what occurred before the Leithcourts left Scotland." "The Leithcourts!" exclaimed Kampf in utter surprise. "Do you know the Leithcourts? And the English officer Durnford?" I looked into his eyes in abject amazement. What connection could Jack Durnford, of the Marines, have with the adventurer Philip Leithcourt? I, however, recollected Jack's word when I had described the visit of the Lola to Leghorn, and further I recollected that very shortly he would be back in London from his term of Mediterranean service. "Well," I said after a pause, "I happen to know Captain Durnford very well, but I had no idea that he was friendly with Leithcourt." The Red Priest smiled, stroking his white beard. "Explain to her Highness what she desires to know, and I will tell you." My eyes met Elma's, and I saw how intensely eager and interested she was, watching the movement of my lips and trying to make out what words I uttered. "Well," I said, "a mysterious tragedy occurred on the edge of a wood near the house rented by Leithcourt, a tragedy which has puzzled the police to this day. An Italian named Santini and his wife were found murdered." "Santini!" gasped Kampf, starting up. "But surely he is not dead?" "No, that's the curious part of the affair. The man who was killed was a man disguised to represent the Italian, while the woman was actually the waiter's wife herself. I happen to know the man Santini well, for both he and his wife were for some years in my employ." The Princess and the director of the Russian revolutionary movement exchanged quick glances. It was as though her Highness implored Kampf to reveal to me the truth, while he, on his part, was averse to doing so. "And upon whom does suspicion rest?" asked her Highness. "As far as I can make out, the police have no clue whatever, except one. At the spot was found a tiny miniature cross of one of the Russian orders of chivalry, the Cross of St. Anne." "There is no suspicion upon Leithcourt?" she asked, with some undue anxiety, I thought. "No." "Did he entertain any guests at the shooting box?" "A good many." "No foreigners among them?" "I never met any. They seemed all people from London, a smart set for the most part." "Then why did the Leithcourts disappear so suddenly?" "Because of the appearance of the man Chater," I replied. "It is evident that they feared him, for they took every precaution against being followed. In fact, they fled, leaving a big party of friends in the house. The man Woodroffe, now at the Hôtel de Paris, is a friend of Leithcourt as well as of Chater." "He was not a guest of Leithcourt when this man representing Santini was assassinated?" asked Kampf, again stroking his beard. "No. As soon as Woodroffe recognized me as a visitor, he left for Hamburg." "He was afraid to face you because of the ransacking of the British Consulate safe at Leghorn," remarked the Princess, who at the same moment took Elma's hand tenderly in her own and looked at her. Then, turning to me, she said, "What you have told us tonight, Mr. Gregg, throws a new light upon certain incidents that had hitherto puzzled us. The mystery of it all is a great and inscrutable one, the mystery of this poor unfortunate girl greatest of all. But both of us will endeavor to help you elucidate it. We will help poor Elma to crush her enemies, these cowardly villains who had maimed her." "Ah, Princess!" I cried. "If you will only help and protect her, you will be doing an act of mercy to a defenseless woman. I love her, I admit it. I have done my utmost. I have striven to solve the dark mystery, but up to the present I have been unsuccessful and have only remained, even till today, the victim of circumstance." "Let her stay with me," the kindly woman answered, smiling tenderly upon my love. "She will be safe here, and in the meantime we will endeavor to discover the real and actual truth." And in response I took the Princess's hand and pressed it fervently. Although that striking white-headed man and the rather stiff formal woman in black were the leaders of the great and all-powerful movement in Russia known throughout the civilized world as the Terror, yet they were nevertheless our friends. They had pledged themselves to help us thwart our enemies. I scribbled a few hasty words upon paper and handed it to Elma. And for answer she smiled contentedly, looking into my eyes with an expression of trust, devotion, and love. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Tsar's Spy by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Just off the Strand. A week had gone by. The Nord Express had brought me post-haste across Europe from Petersburg to Calais, and I was again in London. I had left Elma in the care of the Princess Zurloff, whom I knew would conceal her from the horde of police agents now in search of her. The mystery had so increased until now it had become absolutely bewildering. The more I had tried to probe it, the more inexplicable had I found it. My brain was a whirl as I sat in the wagon-lit, rushing across those wide, never-ending plains that lie between the Russian capital and Berlin, and the green valleys between the Rhinelands and the sea. The maze of mystery rendered me utterly incapable of grasping one solid, tangible fact, so closely interwoven was each incident of the strange life-drama in which, through mere chance, I was now playing a leading part. I was aware of one fact only, that I loved Elma with all my soul, even though I knew not whom she really was, or her strange life story. Her sweet face, with those soft brown eyes, so tender and intense, stood out ever before me, sleeping or waking. Each moment as the express rushed south increased the distance between us. Yet was I not on my way back to England with a clear and distinct purpose? I snatched at any clue, however small, with desperate eagerness, as a drowning man clutches at a straw. It was a cold but dry November night in London, and I sat dining with Jack Durnford at a small table in the big, well-lit room of the Junior United Service Club. Easy-going and merry as of old, my friend was bubbling over with good spirits, delighted to be back again in town after 3 years sailing up and down the Mediterranean from Gib to Smyrna. Manoeuvring always, yet with never a chance of a fight. His well-shaven face bore the mark of the southern suns, and the backs of his hands were tanned by the heat and the sea. He was indeed as smart an officer as any at the Junior, for the Marines are proverbial for their neatness, and his men on board the Bulwark had received many a pleasing compliment from the Admiral. "Glad to be back," he exclaimed, as he helped himself to a peg. "I should rather think so, old chap. You know how awfully wearying the life becomes out there. Lots going on down at Palermo, Malta, Monte Carlo, or over at Algiers, and yet we can never get a chance of it. We're always in sight of the gay places and never land. I don't blame the youngsters for getting off from Leghorn for 2 days over here in town when they can. 3 years is a bigger slice out of a fellow's life than anyone would suppose. But by the way, I saw Hutchison the other day. We put into Spezia, and he came out to see the Admiral. Got dispatches for him, I think. He seems as gay as ever. He lunched at mess and said how sorry he was you deserted Leghorn." "I haven't exactly deserted it," I said, "but I really don't love it like he does." "No, a year or two of the Mediterranean blue is quite sufficient to last any fellow his lifetime. I shouldn't live in Leghorn if I had my choice. I'd prefer somewhere up in the mountains, beyond Pisa or outside Florence, where you can have a good time in winter." Then a silence fell between us, and I sat eating on until the end of the meal, wondering how to broach the question I so desired to put to him. "I shall try if I can get on recruiting service at home for a bit," he said presently. "There's an appointment up in Glasgow vacant, and I shall try for it. It'll be better, at any rate, than China or the Pacific." I was just about to turn the conversation to the visit of the mysterious Lola to Leghorn, when 2 men he knew entered the dining room, and, recognizing him, came across to give him a welcome home. One of the newcomers was Major Bartlett, whom I at once recollected as having been a guest of Leithcourt's up at Rannoch, and the other a younger man whom Durnford introduced me to as Captain Hanbury. "Oh, Major!" I cried, rising and grasping his hand. "I haven't seen you since Scotland and the extraordinary ending to your house party." "No," he laughed. "It was an amazing affair, wasn't it? After the Leithcourts left, it was like pandemonium let loose. The guests collared everything they could lay their hands upon. It's a wonder to me the disgraceful affair didn't get into the papers." "But where's Leithcourt now?" I asked anxiously. "Haven't the ghost of an idea," replied the Major, standing astride with his hands in his pockets. "Young Paget of ours told me the other day that he saw Muriel driving in the Terminus Road at Eastbourne, but she didn't notice him. They were a queerish lot, those Leithcourts," he added. "Hullo! What are you saying about the Leithcourts, Charlie?" exclaimed Durnford, turning quickly from Hanbury. "I know some people of that name, Philip Leithcourt, who has a daughter named Muriel." "Well, they sound much the same. But if you know them, my dear old chap, I really don't envy you your friends," declared the Major with a laugh. "Why not?" "Well, Gregg will tell you," he said. "He knows perhaps more than I do. But," he added, "they may not, of course, be the same people." "I first met them yachting over at Algiers," Jack said, "and then again at Malta, where they seemed to have quite a lot of friends. They had a steam yacht, the Iris, and were often up and down the Mediterranean." "Must be the same people," declared the Major. "Leithcourt spoke once or twice of his yacht, but we all put it down as a non-existent vessel because he was always drawing the long bow about his adventures." "And how did you first come to know him?" I asked of the Major eagerly. "Oh, I don't know. Somebody brought him to mess, and we struck up an acquaintance across the table. He seemed a good chap, and when he asked me to shoot, I accepted. On arrival up at Rannoch, however, one thing struck me as jolly strange, and that was that among the people I was asked to meet was one of the very worst blacklegs about town. He called himself Martin Woodroffe up there, although I'd known him at the old Corinthian Club as Dick Archer. He was believed then to be one of a clever gang of international thieves." "When I first met him, he gave me the name of Hornby," I said. "It was in Leghorn, where he was on board a yacht called the Lola, of which he represented himself as owner." "He left Rannoch very suddenly," remarked Bartlett. "We understood that he was engaged to marry Muriel. If so, I'm sorry for her, poor girl." "What!" cried Durnford, starting up. "That man to marry Muriel Leithcourt?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" But his countenance had turned pale, and he gave no answer to my question. "If these same Leithcourts are really friends of yours, Durnford, old fellow, I'm sorry I've said anything against them," the Major exclaimed in an apologetic tone. "Only the end of my visit was so abrupt and so extraordinary, and the company such a mixed one, that well, to tell you the truth, the people are a mysterious lot altogether." "Perhaps our Leithcourts are not the same as those Jack knows," I remarked, in order to escape from a rather difficult situation. Whereupon Durnford, as though eager to conceal his surprise, said with a forced laugh, "Oh, probably not," and reseated himself at table. Then the Major quickly changed the topic of conversation, and afterwards he and his friend passed along to their table and sat down to eat. I could not help noticing that Jack Durnford was upset at what he had learnt, yet I hesitated just then to put any question to him. I resolved to approach the subject later, so as to allow him time to question me if he wished to do so. After smoking an hour, we went across to the Empire, where we spent the evening in the Grand Circle, meeting many men we knew, and having a rather pleasant time among old acquaintances. If a man who had lived the club life of London returns from abroad, he can always run across someone he knows in the circle of the Empire about 10 o'clock at night. Jack was, however, not his old self that he had been before dinner. His brow was now heavy and thoughtful, and he appeared deeply immersed in some intricate problem, for his eyes were fixed vacantly when opportunity was afforded him to think, and he appeared to desire to avoid his friends rather than to greet them. After the theatre I induced him to come round to the Cecil, and in the wicker chair in the big portico before the entrance we sat to smoke our final cigars. It is a favourite spot of mine when in London, for at afternoon, when the string band plays and other cosmopolitans drink tea, there is a continual coming and going, a little panorama of life that to a student of men like myself is intensely interesting. And at night it is just as amusing to sit there in the shadow and watch the people returning from the theatres or dances, and to speculate as to whom and what they are. At that one little corner of London, just off the Strand, you see more variety of men and women than perhaps at any other spot. All grades pass before you, from the pushful American commercial man interested in a patent medicine, to the proud Indian Rajah with his turbaned suite, from the variety actress to the daughter of a peer, or the wife of a millionaire pork butcher doing Europe. "You've been a bit down in the mouth to-night, Jack," I said presently, after we had been watching the cabs coming up, depositing the home-coming revellers from the Savoy or the Carlton. "Yes," he sighed, "and surely I have enough to cause me, after what I've heard from Bartlett." "What? Did the facts he told you convey any bad news to you?" I inquired with pretended ignorance. "Yes," he said hoarsely, after a brief pause. Then he added, "Bartlett said you could tell me what happened up in Scotland, where Leithcourt had shooting. Tell me everything," he added, with the air of a man in whom all hope is dead. "Well," I began, "the Leithcourts took Rannoch Castle, close to my uncle's place near Dumfries. I got to know them, of course, and often shot with his party. One day, however, I was amazed to notice in one of the rooms the photograph of a lady, the exact counterpart of that picture which I recollect I told you when in Leghorn I had found torn up on board the Lola. You recollect what I narrated about my strange adventure, don't you?" "I remember every word," was his answer. "Go on. What did you do?" "Nothing. I held my tongue. But when I discovered that the fellow who called himself Woodroffe, the man who had represented himself as the owner of the Lola, and who, no doubt, had had a hand in breaking open Hutcheson's safe in the Consulate, was engaged to Muriel, I became full of suspicion." "Well?" "Woodroffe, after meeting me, disappeared. Went to Hamburg, they said, on business. Then other things occurred. A man and a woman were found murdered up in the woods about 1.5 miles from the castle. The man was made up to represent my man, Olinto. I believe you've seen him in Leghorn?" "What? They've killed Olinto?" he gasped, starting from his chair. "No. The fellow was made up very much like him, but his wife, Armida, was killed." "They killed the woman, and believed they had also killed the husband, eh?" he said bitterly through his teeth, and I saw that his strong hands grasped the arms of his chair firmly. "And Martin Woodroffe is engaged to Muriel Leithcourt? Are you certain of this?" "Yes, quite certain." "And is there no suspicion as to who is the assassin of the woman Santini and this mysterious man who posed as her husband?" "None whatever." For some time Jack Durnford smoked in silence, and I could just distinguish his white, hard face in the faint light, for it was now late, and the big electric lamps had been turned out, and we were in semi-darkness. "That fellow shall never marry Muriel," he declared in a fierce, hoarse voice. "What you have just done reveals the truth. Did you meet Chater?" "He appeared suddenly at Rannoch, and the Leithcourts fled precipitately, and have not since been heard of." "Ah, no wonder," he remarked, with a dry laugh. "No wonder. But look here, Gordon, I'm not going to stand by and let that scoundrel Woodroffe marry Muriel." "You love her, perhaps?" I hazarded. "Yes, I do love her," he admitted. "And by heaven," he cried, "I will tell the truth and crush the whole of their ingenious plot." "Have you met Elma Heath?" he asked. "Yes," I said in quick anxiety. Then listen, he said in a low, earnest voice. Listen, and I'll tell you something. There is a greater mystery surrounding that yacht, the Lola, than you have ever imagined, my dear old chap, declared Jack Durnford, looking me straight in the face. When you told me about it on the quarter-deck that day outside Leghorn, I was half a mind to tell you what I knew. Only one fact prevented me, my disinclination to reveal my own secrets. I loved Muriel Leithcourt, yet afloat as I was, I could never see her. I could not obtain from her own lips the explanation I desired. Yet I would not prejudge her. No, and I won't now, he added, with a fierce resolution. I love her, he went on, and she reciprocates my love. Ours is a secret engagement made in Malta 2 years ago. And yet you tell me that she has pledged herself to that fellow Woodroffe, the man known here in London as Dick Archer? I can't believe it. I really can't, old fellow. She could never write to me as she has done, urging patience and secrecy until my return. Unless, of course, she desired to gain time, I suggested. But my friend was silent. His brows were deep knit. Woodroffe is at the present moment in Petersburg, I said. I've just come back from there. In Petersburg, he gasped, surprised. Then he is with that villainous official Baron Oberg, the Governor-General of Finland. No, Oberg is living shut up in his palace at Helsingfors, fearing to go out lest he shall be assassinated, was my answer. And Elma? What has become of her? She is in hiding in Petersburg, awaiting such time as I can get her safely out of Russia. And then, continuing, I explained how she had been maimed and rendered deaf and dumb. What? He cried fiercely. Have they actually done that to the poor girl? Then they feared that she should reveal the nature of their plot, for she had seen and heard. Seen and heard what? Be patient. We will elucidate this mystery and the motive of this terrible infliction upon her. Muriel wrote to me saying that poor Elma, her friend, had disappeared, and she feared that some evil had also happened to her. So Oberg had sent her to his fortress, his own private Bastille, the place to which, on pretended charges of conspiracy against Russia, he sends those who thwart him to a living tomb. I have seen him, and I have defied him, I said. You have? Man alive, be careful! He's not a fellow who sticks at trifles, said Jack warningly. I don't fear, I replied. Elma's enemies are also mine. Then I take it, old fellow, that notwithstanding her affliction, you are actually in love with her? I intend to rescue and to marry her, I answered quite frankly. But first we must tear aside this veil of mystery and ascertain all the facts concerning her, he said. At present I only know one or two very vague details. The Baron is certainly not her uncle, as he represents himself to be, but it seems certain that she is the daughter of Anglo-Russian parents and was born in Russia and brought to England when a child. But from whom do you expect I can obtain the true facts concerning her, and the reason of the Baron's desire to keep her silent? Ah, he said, twisting his moustache thoughtfully, that's just the question. For a solution of the problem, we must first fathom the motive of the Leithcourts and the reason they fled in fear before that fellow Chater. That Muriel is innocent of any complicity in their plot, whatever it may be, I feel convinced. She may be the victim of that blackleg Woodroffe, who, as Bartlett has told you, is one of the most expert swindlers in London and who has already done 2 terms of penal servitude. But what was the motive in breaking open the Consul's safe, if not to obtain the Foreign Office or Admiralty ciphers? Perhaps they wanted to steal them and sell them to a foreign government? No, that was not their object. I've thought it over many, many times since you told me, and I feel convinced that Woodroffe is too shrewd a fellow not to have known that no consul goes away on leave and allows his ciphers to remain behind. When he leaves his post, he always deposits those precious books either at the Foreign Office here, or with his Consul General, or with a consul at another port. They'd certainly ascertain all that before they made the raid, you bet. The affair was a risky one, and Dick Archer is known as a man of many precautions." "But he is on extremely friendly terms with Elma. It was he who succeeded in finding her in Finland and taking her beyond Oberg's sphere of influence to Petersburg." "Then it is certainly only an affected friendship with some sinister motive underlying it." "She wrote a letter from her island prison to an old schoolfellow named Lydia Moreton, asking her to see Woodroffe at his rooms in Cork Street, and tell him that through all she was suffering she had kept her promise to him, and that the secret was still safe." "Exactly. And now the fellow fears that as you are so actively searching out the truth, she may yield to your demands and explain. He therefore intends to silence her." "What? To kill her, you mean?" I gasped, in quick apprehension. "Well, he might do so, in order to save himself, you see," Jack replied, adding, "He certainly would have no compunction if he thought that it would not be brought home to him. Only he, no doubt, fears you, because you have found her and are in love with her." I admitted the force of his argument, but recollected that my dear one was safe in concealment, and that the Princess was our friend, even though I, as an Englishman, had no sympathy with the doctrine of the bomb and the knife. I tried to get from him all that he knew concerning Elma, but he seemed, for some curious reason, disinclined to tell. All I could gather was that Leithcourt was in league with Chater and Woodroffe, and that Muriel had acted as an entirely innocent agent. What the conspiracy was, or what was its motive, I could not discern. I was as far off the solution of the problem as ever. "We must first find Muriel," he declared, when I pressed him to tell me everything he knew. "There are facts you have told me which negative my own theories, and only from her can we obtain the real truth." "But surely you know where she is? She writes to you," I said. "The last letter which I received at Gib 10 days ago was from the Hotel Bristol at Botzen in the Tyrol. Yet Bartlett says she has been seen down at Eastbourne." "But you have an address where you always write to her, I suppose?" "Yes, a secret one. I have written and made an appointment, but she has not kept it. She has been prevented, of course. She may be with her parents and unable to come to London." "You did not know that they had fled and were in hiding?" "Of course not. What I've heard tonight is news to me. Amazing news." "And does it not convey to you the truth?" "It does, a ghastly truth concerning Elma Heath," he answered in a low voice, as though speaking to himself. "Tell me what? I'm dying, Jack, to know everything concerning her. Who is that fellow Oberg?" "Her enemy. She, by mere accident, learned his secret and Woodroffe's, and now they both live in deadly fear of her." "And for that reason she was taken to Siena, where some villainous Italian doctor was bribed to render her deaf and dumb?" He nodded in the affirmative. "But Chater?" "I know very little concerning him. He may have conspired with them, or he may be innocent. It seems as though he were antagonistic to their schemes, if Leithcourt and his family really fled from him." "And yet he was on board the Lola. Indeed, he may have helped to commit the burglary at the Consulate," I said. "Quite likely," he answered. "But our first object must be to rediscover Muriel. Paget says she is in Eastbourne. If she is there, we shall easily find her. They publish visitors' lists in the papers, don't they, like they do at Hastings?" Then he added, "Visitors' lists are most annoying when you find your name printed in them when you are supposed officially to be somewhere else. I was had once like that by the Bournemouth papers, when I was supposed to be on duty over at Queenstown. I narrowly escaped a terrible wigging." "Shall we go to Eastbourne?" I suggested eagerly. "I'll go there with you in the morning." "Or would it not be best to send an urgent wire to the address where I always write? She would then reply here, no doubt. If she's in Eastbourne, there may be reasons why she cannot come up to town. If her people are in hiding, of course she won't come, but she'll make an appointment with me, no doubt." "Very well. Send a wire," I said, "and make it urgent. It will then be forwarded. But as regards Olinto, would you like to see him? He might tell you more than he has told me." "No, by no means. He must not know that I have returned to London," declared my friend quickly. "You had better not see him. You understand? Then his interests are, well, not exactly our own?" "No." "But why don't you tell me more about Elma?" I urged, for I was eager to learn all he knew. "Come, do tell me," I implored. "I've told you practically everything, my dear fellow," was his response. "The revelation of the true facts of the affair can be made only by Muriel. I tell you we must find her." "Yes, we must, at all hazards," I said. "Let's go across to the telegraph office opposite Charing Cross. It's open always." And we rose and walked out along the Strand, now nearly deserted, and dispatched an urgent message to Muriel at an address in Hurlingham Road, Fulham. Afterwards we stood outside on the curb, still talking, I loath to part from him, when there passed by in the shadow 2 men in dark overcoats who crossed the road behind us to the front of Charing Cross Station and then continued on towards Trafalgar Square. As the light of the street lamp fell upon them, I thought I recognized the face of one as that of a person I had seen before, yet I was not at all certain, and my failure to remember whom the passer-by resembled prevented me from saying anything further to Jack than, "A fellow I know has just gone by, I think." "We seem to be meeting hosts of friends tonight," he laughed. "After all, old chap, it does one good to come back to our dear, dirty old town again. We abuse it when we are here, and talk of the life in Paris and Vienna and Brussels. But when we are away there is no place on earth so dear to us, for it is home. But there," he laughed, "I'm actually growing romantic. Ah, if we could only find Muriel! But we must to-morrow. Ta-ta! I shall go around to the club and sleep, for I haven't fixed on any diggings yet. Come in at 10 to-morrow, and we will decide upon some plan. One thing is plainly certain. Elma must at once be got out of Russia. She's in deadly peril of her life there." "Yes," I said, "and you will help me?" "With all my heart, old fellow," answered my friend, warmly grasping my hand, and then when we parted, he strolling along towards the National Gallery on his way back to the Junior, while I returned to the Cecil alone. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Marked men. "Captain Durnford?" I inquired of the hall porter of the club the next morning. "Not here, sir." "But he slept here last night," I remarked. "I have an appointment with him." The man consulted the big book before him and answered, "Captain Durnford went out at 9:27 last night, sir, but has not returned." Strange, I thought, but although I waited in the club nearly an hour, he did not put in an appearance. I called again at noon, and he had not come in, and again at 2 o'clock, but he had not even then made his appearance. Then I began to be anxious. I returned to the hotel, resolved to wait for a few hours longer. He might have altered his mind and gone to Eastbourne in search of Muriel, yet had he done so he would surely have telegraphed to me. About 4 o'clock, as I was passing through the big hall of the hotel, I heard a voice behind me utter a greeting in Italian, and turning in surprise found Olinto, dressed in his best suit of black, standing hat in hand. In an instant I recollected what Jack had told me, and regarded him with some suspicion. "Signor Commendatore," he said in a low voice, as though fearing to be overheard, "may I be permitted to speak in private with you?" "Certainly," I said, and I took him in the lift up to my room. "I have come to warn you, signore," he said, when I had given him a seat. "Your enemies mean harm to you." "And who are they, pray?" I asked, biting my lips. "The same, I suppose, who prepared that ingenious trap in Lambeth?" "I am not here to reveal to you who they are, signore, only to warn you to have a care of yourself. was the Italian's reply. "Look here, Olinto," I exclaimed determinedly. "I've had enough of this confounded mystery. Tell me the truth regarding the assassination of your poor wife up in Scotland." "Ah, signore," he answered sadly in a changed voice. "I do not know. It was a plot. Someone represented me, but he was killed also. They believed they had struck me down," he added with a bitter laugh. "Poor Armida's body was found concealed behind a rock on the opposite side of the wood. I saw it. Ah!" he cried, shuddering. "Then you were ignorant of the identity of your wife's assassin?" "Entirely." "Tell me one thing," I said. "Did Armida possess any trinket in the form of a little enamelled cross, like a miniature cross of Cavaliere?" "Yes, I gave it to her. I found it on the floor at the Mansion House where I was engaged as odd waiter for a banquet. I know I ought to have given it up to the Lord Mayor's servants, but it was such a pretty little thing that I was tempted to keep it. It probably had fallen from the coat of one of the diplomatists dining there." I was silent. The faint suspicion that Oberg had been at that spot was now entirely removed. The only clue I had was satisfactorily accounted for. "Why do you ask, Signor Commendatore?" he added. "Because the cross was found at the spot and was believed to have been dropped by the assassin," I said. The police had, it seemed, succeeded in discovering the unfortunate woman after all, and had found that she was his wife. "You know a man named Leithcourt?" I asked a few moments later. "Now tell the truth. In this affair, Olinto, our interests are mutual, are they not?" He nodded after a moment's hesitation. "And you know also that a man named Archer, who is sometimes known as Hornby or Woodroffe, as well as a friend of his called Chater?" "Si, signore," he said. "I have met them all, to my regret." "And have you ever met a Russian, a certain Baron Oberg, and his niece, Elma Heath?" "His niece? She isn't his niece." "Then who is she?" I demanded. "How do I know? I have seen her once or twice. But she's dead, isn't she? She knew the secret of those men, and they intended to kill her. I tried to prevent them taking her away on the yacht, and I would have gone to the police, only I dare not." "Why?" "Well, because my own hands were not quite clean," he answered after a pause, his eyes fixed upon mine the while. "I knew they intended to silence her, but I was powerless to save her, poor young lady. They took her on board the Leithcourt's yacht, the Iris, and they sailed for the Mediterranean, I believe." "Then the name and appearance of the yacht was altered on the voyage, and it became the Lola," I said. "No doubt," he smiled. "The Iris was a steamer of many names, and had, I believe, been painted nearly all the colors of the rainbow at various times. It was a mysterious vessel, but she exists no more. They scuttled her somewhere up in the Baltic, I've heard." "And who is this Oberg?" I inquired, urging him to reveal to me all he knew concerning him. "He stands in great fear of the poor young lady, I believe, for it was at his instigation that Leithcourt and his friends took her on that fatal yachting cruise." "And what was your connection with them?" "Well, I was Leithcourt's servant," was his reply. "I was steward on the Iris for a year, until I suppose they thought that I began to see too much, and then I was placed in a position ashore." "And what did you see?" "More than I care to tell, signore. If they were arrested, I should be arrested too, you see." "But I mean to solve this mystery, Olinto," I said fiercely, for I was in no trifling mood. "I'll fathom it if it costs me my life." "If the signore solves it himself, then I cannot be charged with revealing the truth," was the man's diplomatic reply. "But I fear that they are far too wary." "Armida has lost her life. Surely that is sufficient incentive for you to bring them all to justice?" "Of course, but if the law falls upon them, it will also fall upon me." I explained the terrible affliction to which my love had been subjected by those heartless brutes, whereupon he cried enthusiastically, Then she is not dead! She can tell us everything!" "But cannot you tell us?" "No, not all. The secret she knows has never been revealed. They feared she might be incautious, and for that reason Oberg made the villainous suggestion of the yachting trip. She was to be drowned accidentally, of course. She is in St. Petersburg now. I left her a week ago." "In Russia! Ah, signore, for her sake, don't allow the young lady to remain there. The Baron is all powerful. He does what he wishes in Russia, and the more merciless he is to the people he governs, the greater rewards he receives from the Czar. I have never been in Russia, but surely it must be a strange country, signore." "Well," I said, sitting upon the edge of the bed and looking at him, "are you prepared to denounce them if I bring the Signorina Heath here to England?" "But what is the use if we have no clear proof?" was his evasive reply. I could see plainly that he feared being himself implicated in some extraordinary plot, the exact nature of which he so steadfastly refused to reveal to me. We talked on for fully half an hour, and from his conversation I gathered that he was well acquainted with Elma. "Ah, signore, she was such a pleasant and kind-hearted young lady. I always felt very sorry for her. She was in deadly fear of them." "Because they were thieves?" I hazarded. "Ah, worse!" "But why did they induce you to entice me to that house in Lambeth? Why did they so evidently desire that I should be killed?" "By accident," he interrupted, correcting me. "Always by accident," and he smiled grimly. "Surely you know their secret motive?" I remarked. "At the time I did not," he declared. "I acted on their instructions, being compelled to, for they hold my future in their hands. Therefore I could not disobey. You knew too much, therefore you were marked down for death, just as you are now." "And who is it who is now seeking my life?" I inquired gravely. "I only returned from Russia yesterday." "Your movements are well known," answered the young Italian. "You cannot be too careful. Woodroffe has been in Russia with you, has he not?" I replied in the affirmative, whereupon he said "I thought so, but was not quite sure." "And Chater?" I inquired. "Where is he?" "In London." "And the Leithcourts?" He shrugged his shoulders with a gesture of ignorance, adding, "The Signorina Muriel returned to London from Eastbourne this morning." "Where can I find her?" I inquired eagerly. "It is of the utmost importance that I should see her." "She is with a relation, a cousin, I think, at Bassett Road, Notting Hill. The house is called Holmwood." "You have seen her?" "No. I heard she had returned." "And her father is still hiding from Chater?" "He is still in hiding, but Chater is his best friend." "That is curious," I remarked, recollecting the hurried departure from Rannoch. "They've made it up, I suppose?" "They never quarreled, to my knowledge." "Then why did Leithcourt leave Scotland so hurriedly on Chater's arrival? You know all about the affair, of course?" He nodded, saying with a grim smile, "Yes, I know. The party up there must have been a very interesting one. If the police could have made a raid on the place, they would have found among the guests certain persons long 'wanted.' But the arrival of Chater and the flight of Leithcourt had an ulterior object. Chater had never been Leithcourt's enemy." "But I can't understand that," I said. "Why should Leithcourt have attacked Chater, rendered him unconscious, and shut him up in the cupboard in the library?" "Was it Leithcourt who did that?" he asked dubiously. "I think not. It was another of the guests, who was Chater's bitterest enemy. But Philip Leithcourt took advantage of the fracas in order to make believe that he had fled because of Chater's arrival. Ah," he added, "you haven't any idea of their ruses. They are amazing." "So it seems," I said, nevertheless only half convinced that the Italian was telling me the truth. If it was really, as he had said, that the arrival of Chater and the flight was merely a blind, then the mystery was again deepened. "Then who was the man who attacked Chater?" I asked. "Only Chater himself knows. It was one of the guests, that is quite evident." "And you say that the flight had been prearranged?" I remarked. "Yes, with a distinct motive," he said. Then, after a pause, he added with a strange, earnest look in his dark eyes: "Pardon me, Signor Commendatore, if I presume to suggest something, will you not?" "Certainly. What do you suggest?" "That you should remain here in this hotel and not venture out." "For fear of something unfortunate happening to me?" I laughed. "I'm really not afraid, Olinto," I added. "You know I carry this," and I drew out my revolver from my hip pocket. "I know, signore," he said anxiously, "but you might not be afforded opportunity for using it. When they lay a trap, they bait it well." "I know. They're a set of the most ingenious scoundrels in London, it's very evident. Yet I don't fear them in the least," I declared. "I must rescue the Signorina Heath." "But, signore, have a care for yourself," cried the Italian, laying his hand upon my arm. "You are a marked man." "Ah, do not I know?" he exclaimed breathlessly. "If you go out you may run right into well, the fatal accident." "Never fear, Olinto," I said reassuringly. "I shall keep my eyes well open. Here in London one's life is safer than anywhere else in the world, perhaps. Certainly safer than in some places I could name in your own country, eh?" At which he grinned. The next moment he grew serious again and said: "I only warn the signore that if he goes out it is at his own peril." "Then let it be so," I laughed, feeling self-confident that no one could lead me into any trap. I was neither a foreigner nor a country cousin. I knew London too well. He was silent and shook his head. Then, after telling me that he was still at the same restaurant in Westbourne Grove, he took his departure, warning me once more not to go forth. Half an hour later, disregarding his words, I strode out into the Strand and again walked round to the "Junior." The short wintry day had ended, the gas lamps were lit, and the darkness of night was gradually creeping on. Jack had not been to the club, and I began now to grow thoroughly uneasy. He had parted from me at the corner of the Strand, with only 5 minutes' walk before him, and yet he had apparently disappeared. My first impulse was to drive to Notting Hill to inquire of Muriel if she had news of him, but somehow the Italian's warning words made me wonder if he had met with foul play. I suddenly recollected those two men who had passed by as we had talked, and how that the features of one had seemed strangely familiar. Therefore I took a cab to the police station down at Whitehall, and made inquiry of the inspector on duty in the big bare office with its flaring gas jets in wire globes. He heard me to the end, then turning back the book of occurrences before him, glanced through the ruled entries. "I should think this is the gentleman, sir," he said, and he read to me the entry as follows: "PC 462A reports that at 2:07 a.m., while on duty outside the National Gallery, he heard a revolver shot followed by a man's cry. He ran to the corner of Suffolk Street, where he found a gentleman lying upon the pavement, suffering from a serious shot wound in the chest, and quite unconscious. He obtained the assistance of PCs 218A and 343A, and the gentleman, who was not identified, was taken to the Charing Cross Hospital, where the house surgeon expressed a doubt whether he could live. Neither PCs recollect having noticed any suspicious-looking person in the vicinity. John Percival, Inspector." I waited for no more, but rushed round to the hospital in the cab, and was, 5 minutes later, taken along the ward, where I identified poor Jack lying in bed, white-faced and unconscious. "The doctor was here a quarter of an hour ago," whispered the sister, "and he fears he is sinking." "He has uttered no words?" I asked anxiously. "Made no statement?" "None. He has never regained consciousness, and I fear, sir, he never will. It is a case of deliberate murder, the police told me early this morning." I clenched my fists and swore a fierce revenge for that dastardly act. and as I stood beside the narrow bed, I realized that what Olinto had said regarding my own peril was the actual truth. I was a marked man. Was I never to penetrate that inscrutable and ever-increasing mystery? End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Tsar's Spy by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The truth about the Lola. Throughout the long night I called many times at the hospital, but the reply was always the same. Jack had not regained consciousness, and the doctor regarded his case as hopeless. In the morning I drove in hot haste to Bassett Road, Notting Hill, and at the address Olinto had given me found Muriel. When she entered the room with folding doors into which I had been shown, I saw that she was pale and apprehensive, for we had not met since her flight, and she was, no doubt, at a loss for an explanation. But I did not press her for one. I merely told her that the Italian Santini had given me her address, and that I came as bearer of unfortunate news. "What is it?" she gasped quickly. "It concerns Captain Durnford," I replied. "He has been injured in the street and is in Charing Cross Hospital." "Ah!" she cried. "I see. You do not explain the truth. By your face I can tell there is something more. He's dead. Tell me the worst." "No, Miss Leithcourt," I said gravely. "Not dead, but the doctors fear that he may not recover. His wound is dangerous. He has been shot by some unknown person." "Shot!" she echoed, bursting into tears. "Then they have followed him after all. They have deceived me, and now, as they intend to take him from me, I will protect him. You, Mr. Gregg, have been in peril of your life, that I know, but Jack's enemies are yours, and they shall not go unpunished. May I see him?" "I fear not, but we will ask at the hospital." And after the exchange of some further explanations, we took a hansom back to Charing Cross. At first the sister refused to allow Muriel to see the patient, but she implored so earnestly that at last she consented, and the distressed girl in the black coat and hat crept on tiptoe to the bedside. "He was conscious for a quarter of an hour or so," whispered the nurse who sat there. "He asked after some lady named Muriel." The girl at my side burst into low sobbing. "Tell him," she said, "that Muriel is here, that she has seen him and is waiting for him to recover." We were not allowed to linger there, and on leaving the hospital I took her back again to Notting Hill, promising to keep her well informed of Jack's condition. He had returned to consciousness, therefore there was now a faint hope for his recovery. Day succeeded day, and although I was not allowed to visit my friend, I was told that he was very slowly progressing. I idled at the Hotel Cecil, longing daily for news of Elma. Only once did a letter come from her, a brief, well-written note from which it appeared that she was quite well and happy, although she longed to be able to go out. The Princess was very kind indeed to her, and, she added, was making secret arrangements for her escape across the Russian frontier into Germany. I knew what that meant. Use was to be made of certain Russian officials who were secretly allied with the revolutionists in order to secure her safe conduct beyond the power of that order of exile of the tyrant de Plehve. I wrote to her under cover to the Princess, but there had been no time yet for a reply. I saw Muriel many times, but never once did she refer to Rannoch or their sudden departure. Her only thought was of the man she loved. "I always believed that you were engaged to Mr. Woodroffe," I said one day, when I called to tell her of Jack's latest bulletin. "It is true that he asked me to marry him," she responded, "but there were reasons why I did not accept." "Reasons connected with his past, eh?" She smiled, and then said, "Ah, Mr. Gregg, it is all a strange and very tragic story. I must see Jack. When do you think they will allow me to go to him?" I explained that the doctor feared to cause the patient any undue excitement, but that in 2 or 3 days there was hope of her being allowed to visit him. Several times the police made inquiry of me, but I could tell them nothing. I could not for the life of me recollect where I had before seen the face of that man who had passed in the darkness. One afternoon, 10 days after the attempt upon Jack, I was allowed to sit by his bedside and question him. "Ah, Gordon, old fellow," he said faintly, "I've had a narrow escape, by Jove! After I left you I walked quickly on towards the club, when all of a sudden 2 scoundrels sprang out of Suffolk Street, and one of them fired a revolver full at me. Then I knew no more." "But who were the men? Did you recognize them?" "No, not at all. That's the worst of it." "But Muriel knows who they were," I said. "Ah, yes. Bring her here, won't you?" the poor fellow implored. "I'm dying to see her once again." Then I told him how she had looked upon him while unconscious, and how I had taken the daily bulletin to her. For an hour I talked with him, urging him to get well soon, so that we could unite in probing the mystery and bringing to justice those responsible for the dastardly act. "Muriel knows, and if she loves you she will no doubt assist us," I said. "Oh, she does love me, Gordon. I know that," said the prostrate man, smiling contentedly, and when I left promised to bring her there on the morrow. This I did, but having conducted her to the bed at the end of the ward, I discreetly withdrew. What she said to him I am not, of course, aware. All I know is that an hour later, when I returned, I found them the happiest pair possible to conceive, and I clearly saw that Jack's trust in her was not ill placed. But of Elma? No further word had come from her, and I began to grow uneasy. The days went on. I wrote twice, but no reply was forthcoming. At last I could bear the suspense no longer, and began to contemplate returning to Russia. Jack, when at last discharged from the hospital, came across to the Cecil and lived with me in preference to the junior. He was very weak at first, and I looked after him, while every day Muriel came and ate with us, brightening our lives by her smart and merry chatter. She knew that I loved Elma, and was also aware of the exciting events in Russia, Jack having told her of them during their long drives in hansoms when he went out with her to take the air. One day I received a brief note from the Princess in Petersburg, urging me to remain patient and saying Elma was quite safe and well. There were reasons, however, why she was unable to write, she added. What were they, I wondered? Yet I could only wait until I received word to travel back to Russia and fetch her home. The Princess had promised to arrange everything. December came, and we still remained on at the hotel. Once Olinto had written me repeating his warning, but I did not heed it. I somehow distrusted the fellow. Jack, now thoroughly recovered, called almost daily at Bassett Road, and would often bring Muriel to the Cecil to tea or to luncheon. Often I inquired the whereabouts of her father and Hilton Chater, but she declared herself in entire ignorance and believed they were abroad. One afternoon, shortly before Christmas, as we were idling in the American bar of the hotel, my friend told me that Muriel had invited us to tea at her cousin's that afternoon, and accordingly we went there in company. The drawing-room into which we were ushered was familiar to me as the apartment wherein I had told Muriel of the attempt upon her lover's life. As we sat together, Muriel, a smart figure in a pale blue gown, poured tea for us and chatted more merrily, I thought, than ever before. She seemed quick and nervous, and yet full of happiness, as she should indeed have been, for Jack Durnford was one of the best fellows in the world, and his restoration to health little short of miraculous. "Gordon," he said to me with a sudden seriousness, when tea had ended and we had placed down our cups, "I want to tell you something I've been longing always to tell you, and now I have got dear Muriel's consent, I want to tell you about her father and his friends." "And about Elma too?" I said in quick eagerness. "Yes, tell me everything." "No, not everything, for I don't know it myself. But what I know I will explain as briefly as I can, and leave you to form your own conclusions. It is," he went on, "a strange, most amazing story. When I myself became first cognizant of the mystery, I was on board the flagship, the Renown, under Admiral Sir John Fisher. We were lying in Malta when there arrived the English yacht Iris, owned by Mr. Philip Leithcourt, and among those on board cruising for pleasure were Mr. Martin Woodroffe, Mr. Hilton Chater, and the owner's wife and daughter Muriel. Muriel and I first met at a tennis party, and afterwards frequently at various houses in Malta, for anyone who goes there and entertains is soon entertained in return. A mutual attachment sprang up between Muriel and myself," he said, placing his hand tenderly upon hers and smiling, "and we often met in secret and took long walks, until quite suddenly Leithcourt said it was necessary to sail for Smyrna to pick up some friends who had been traveling in Palestine. The night they sailed a great consternation was caused on the island by the news that the safe in the Admiral Superintendent's office had been opened by expert safe breakers, and certain most important secret documents stolen." "Well?" I asked, much interested. Again, 2 months later, when the villa of the Prince of Montevacchi at Palmero was broken into, and the whole of the famous jewels of the Princess stolen, it was a very strange fact that the Iris was at that moment in port. But it was not until the third occasion, when the yacht was at Villefranche, and our squadron being at Toulon, I got 4 days' leave to go along the Riviera, that my suspicions were aroused, for at that very hour when I was dining at the London house at Nice with Muriel and a schoolfellow of hers, Elma Heath, who was spending the winter there with a lady who was Baron Oberg's cousin, that a great robbery was committed in one of the big hotels up at Simiez, the wife of an American millionaire losing jewels valued at £30,000. Then the robberies, coincident with the visit of the yacht, aroused my strong suspicion. I remarked the nature of those documents stolen from Malta, and recognized that they could only be of service to a foreign government. Then came the Leghorn incident of which you told me. The yacht's name had been changed to the Lola, and she had been repainted. I made searching inquiry, and found that on the evening she was purposely run aground in order to strike up a friendship at the Consulate, a Russian gunboat was lying in the vicinity. The Consul's safe was rifled, and the scheme certainly was to transfer anything obtained from it to the Russian gunboat." "But what was in the safe?" I asked. "Fortunately, nothing. But you see they knew that our squadron was due in Leghorn, and that some extremely important dispatches were on the way to the Admiral, secret orders based upon the decision of the British Cabinet as to the vexed question of Russian ships passing the Dardanelles. They expected that they would be lodged in the safe until the arrival of the squadron, as they always are. They were, however, bitterly disappointed because the dispatches had not arrived." "And then?" "Well, the only Russian who appeared to have any connection with them was Baron Oberg, the Governor-General of Finland, whose habit it was to spend part of the winter in the Mediterranean. From Elma Heath's conversation at dinner that evening at Nice, I gathered that she and her uncle had been guests on the Iris on several occasions, although I must say that Muriel was extremely reticent regarding all that concerned the yacht. "Of course," she said quickly. "Now that I have told you the truth, Jack, don't you think it was only natural?" "Most certainly, dear," he answered, still holding her hand. "Yours was not a secret that you could very well tell to me until you could thoroughly trust me, especially as your father had been implicated in the theft of those documents from Malta. The truth is," he said, turning to me, "Philip Leithcourt has been all along the catspaw of Baron Oberg. A few years ago he was a well-known moneylender in the city, and in that capacity met the Baron, who, being in disgrace, required a loan. He was also in the habit of having certain shady transactions with that daring gang of continental thieves of whom Dick Archer and Hilton Chater were leaders. For this reason he purchased a yacht for their use, so that they might not only use it for the purpose of storing the stolen goods, but for the purpose of sailing from place to place under the guise of wealthy Englishmen travelling for pleasure. Upon that vessel, indeed, were stored thousands and thousands of pounds worth of jewels and objects of value, the proceeds of many great robberies in England, France, and Belgium. Sometimes they travelled for the purpose of disposing of the jewels in various inland towns where the gems, having been recut, were not recognized, while at other times Chater and Archer, assisted by Mackintosh, the captain, and Olinto Santini, the steward, sailed for a port, landed, committed a robbery, and then sailed away again, quite unsuspected as rich Englishmen. "And the crew?" I asked after a pause. They were, of course, well paid, and were kept in ignorance of what the supposed owner and his friends did ashore. "But Oberg's connection with it?" I asked, surprised at those revelations. "Ah!" exclaimed Muriel. "The ingenuity of that crafty villain is fiendish. Before he got into the Czar's favour he owed my father a large sum, and then sought how to evade repayment. By means of his spies he discovered the real purpose of the cruises of the Iris, for I was often taken on board with a maid in order to allay any suspicion that might arise if only men were cruising. Then he not only compelled my father to cancel the debt, but he impressed the vessel and those who owned and navigated it into the secret service of Russia. A dozen times did we make attempts to obtain secret papers from Italian, French, and English dockyards, but only once in the case of Malta, and once at Toulon, did we succeed. Ah, Mr. Gregg," she added, "you do not know all the anxiety I suffered, how at every hour we were in danger of betrayal or capture, and of the 100 narrow escapes we have had of Customs House officers rummaging the yacht for contraband. You will no doubt recollect the sensation caused by the theft of the jewels of the Princess Wilhelmina of Schaumburg-Lippe from the lady's maid in the Rapide between Cannes and Les Arcs, the robbery from the Marseille branch of the Crédit Lyonnais, and the great haul of plate from the Chateau of Bardon, the Paris millionaire, close to Arcachon." "Yes," I said, for they were all robberies of which I had read in the newspapers a couple of years before. "Well," she said, "they were all committed by Archer or Woodroffe and his gang, with accomplices ashore, of course, and never once did it seem that any suspicion fell upon us. While the police were frantically searching hither and thither, we used to weigh anchor and calmly steam away with our booty on board. We had with us an old Dutch lapidary, and one of the cabins was fitted as a workshop, where he altered the appearance of the stones, and prepared them ready for sale, while the gold was melted in a crucible and put ashore to be sent to agents in Hamburg." "But that night in Leghorn," I said, "what happened to poor Elma?" "I do not know," was Muriel's reply. "We were both on board together, and standing at the crack of the door watched you sitting at dinner that evening. Elma told me that she believed that there was a plot against your life, but why she would not tell me. She evidently knew of the proposed rifling of the safe at the Consulate. Oberg himself was also on board, locked in his own cabin. Elma must have overheard some conversation between the Baron and one of the others, for she was in great fear the whole time lest they might injure you. Yet it seemed, after all, as though their idea was the same as always, to worm themselves into your confidence. The instant, however, you went ashore, Chater, Woodroffe, whom you called Hornby, and Mackintosh, the captain, who, by the way, was an old ticket of leave man, went ashore and of course broke into the Consulate. Then, as soon as they returned, Elma came to my cabin, awoke me, and said that the Baron was taking her ashore, and that they were to travel overland back to London. She was ready dressed to go, therefore I kissed her, and promising to meet her soon, we parted. That was the last I saw of her. What happened to her afterwards, only she alone can tell us." "But she is not the Baron's niece," I said. "No, there is some mystery," declared Muriel. "She holds some secret which he fears she may divulge. but of what nature I am in ignorance." "Then you say that your father has never taken any active part in the robberies?" I remarked. "No. He commenced by lending money, and amassed a considerable fortune. Then avarice seized him, as it does so many men, and coming into contact with Archer and his friends, he saw that the idea of the yacht was a safe and profitable one. Therefore he purchased the vessel, and ran it at the disposition of the thieves, and subsequently under compulsion in the secret service of Russia, as I have already described to you. The profits were colossal. In 1 year my father's share was £80,000. "And where is your father now?" I asked. "Ah!" she exclaimed sadly, her face pale and haggard. "I have heard that the vessel was scuttled somewhere in the Baltic." "That is true. Oberg's purpose having been served, he demanded half the property on board, or he would give notice to the Russian naval authorities that the pirate yacht was afloat. He attempted to blackmail my father, as he had already done so many times, but his scheme was frustrated. My father, because of his inhuman treatment of poor Elma, defied him, when it appears that Oberg, who was in Helsingfors, telegraphed to the admiral of the Russian fleet in the Baltic. The crew from the Iris were at once landed at Riga, and only Mackintosh and my father put to sea again. Ah, my father was desperate, for he knew the merciless character of the man whose victim he had been for so long. They watched a Russian cruiser bearing down upon them, when, just as it drew near, they got off in a boat and blew up the yacht, which sank in 3 minutes with its ill-obtained wealth on board." "And your father?" She was silent, and I saw tears standing in her eyes. "There was a tragedy," Jack explained in a low, hoarse voice. "He and the captain did not, unfortunately, get sufficiently far from the yacht when they blew her up, and they went down with her." And I looked in silence at Muriel, who stood with her head bent and her white face covered with her hands. Almost at the same moment there was a low tap on the door, and the servant maid announced, "Mr. Santini, miss." "Ah!" exclaimed Jack quickly, as Olinto entered the room. "Then you had my note. We have asked you here to reveal to us this dastardly plot which seemed to have been formed against Mr. Gregg and myself. As you know, I've had a narrow escape." "I know, signore, and the Signor Commendatore is also threatened." "By whom?" "By those who killed my poor wife, and who intended also to silence me," was his answer. "The same who compelled you to take me to that house where the fatal chair was prepared, eh?" "It was Archer, who, fearing that you came to London in search of them, devised that devilish contrivance," he said in his broken English. Then, continuing, he went on fiercely, "Now that I have discovered why my poor Armida was killed, I will tell the truth and not spare them. Since you left Scotland, signore, I have been up in Dumfries, and I have discovered several facts which prove that for some reason known only to himself, Leithcourt, while at Rannoch, wrote to both Armida and myself separately, making an appointment to see us at the same time at that spot on the edge of the wood, as he had some secret commission to entrust to us. The letter addressed to me apparently fell into somebody else's hands, probably one of the secret agents of Baron Oberg, who were always watching Leithcourt's doing, and he, anxious to learn what was intended, made himself up to look like me, and kept the appointment in my place. Armida, having received the letter unknown to me, went up to Scotland, and was also there at the appointed time. What actually transpired can only be surmised, yet it seems that Leithcourt was in the habit of going up to that spot and loitering there in the evening in order to meet Chater in secret, as the latter was in hiding in a small hotel in Dumfries. Therefore, those who formed the plot must have endeavoured to throw suspicion upon Leithcourt. It is plain, however, as both myself and Armida knew the gang, it was to their interest to get rid of us, because the suspicions of the police had at last become aroused. Poor Armida was therefore deliberately enticed there to her death, while the inquisitive man whom the assassin took to be myself was also struck down." "By whom?" "Not by Chater, for he was in London on that night." "Then by Woodroffe?" Durnford said. "Without a doubt. It was to his advantage alone to close our lips, because in that same fatal chair in Lambeth old Jacob Moser, the Jew bullion broker of Hatton Garden, met his death, a most dastardly crime with which none of his friends were associated, and of which we alone held knowledge. He therefore wrote to us as though from Leithcourt, calling us up to Rannoch in order to strike the blows in the darkness," he added in his peculiar Italian manner. "Besides, he feared we would tell the signore the truth." "You have not told the police?" "I dare not, signore. Surely the less the police know about this matter the better, otherwise the Signorina Leithcourt must suffer for her father's avarice and evil doing." "Yes," cried Jack anxiously. "That's right, Olinto. The police must know nothing. The reprisals we must make ourselves. But who was it who shot me in Suffolk Street?" "The same man, Martin Woodroffe." "Then the assassin is back from Russia?" "He followed closely behind the Signor Commendatore. Markoff, a clever secret agent of Baron Oberg's, came with him." Then, for the first time, I recollected that the man I had recognized in the Strand was a fellow I had seen lounging in the ante-room of the palace of the Governor-General of Finland. The pair, fearing that I should reveal what I knew, were undoubtedly in London to take my life in secret. Now that Leithcourt was dead, Woodroffe had united forces with Oberg, and intended to silence me because they feared that Elma, besides escaping them, had also revealed her secret. "I trust that the Signorina Leithcourt has explained the story of the yacht and its crew," Olinto remarked, "and has also shown you how I was implicated. You will therefore discern the reason why I have hitherto feared to give you any explanation." "Yes," I said. "Miss Leithcourt has told me a great deal, but not everything. I cannot yet gather for what reason she and her father fled from Rannoch." "Then I will tell you," said Muriel quickly. "My father suspected Woodroffe of being the assassin in Rannoch Wood, for he knew that he had broken away from the original compact and had now allied himself with Oberg. Yet it was also my father's object to appear in fear of them, because he was only awaiting an opportunity to lay plans for poor Elma's rescue from Finland. Therefore, one evening Woodroffe called, and my father encountered him in the avenue, and admitted him with his own latchkey by one of the side doors of the castle, afterwards taking him up to the study. He knew that he had come to try and make terms for Oberg, therefore he saw that he must fly at once to Newcastle, where the Iris was lying, to get on board and sail away. With some excuse he left him in the study, and then warned my mother and myself to prepare to leave. But while we were packing, it appeared that Chater, who had followed, was shown into the study by the butler, or rather he entered there himself, being well acquainted with the house. Thus the two men, now bitter enemies, met. A fierce quarrel must have ensued, and Chater was poisoned and concealed, Woodroffe, of course, believing that he had killed him. My father entered the study again, and seeing only Woodroffe there, did not know what had occurred. Some words probably arose when my father again turned and left. Then we fled to Carlisle and on to Newcastle, and next morning were on board the yacht out in the North Sea, afterwards landing at Rotterdam. Those, she added, are briefly the facts, as my poor father related them to me. "And what of poor Elma, and of her secret? When, I wonder, shall I see her?" I cried in despair. "You will see her now, signore," answered Olinto. "A servant of the Prince Zurloff brought her to London this afternoon, and I have just conveyed her from the station. She is in the next room, in ignorance, however, that you are here." And without another word I fled forward joyfully and threw open the folding doors which separated me from my silent love. Silent, yes, but she could nevertheless tell her story, surely the strangest that any woman has ever lived to tell. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 and conclusion of The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18 contains Elma's story. Before me stood my love, a slim, tragic, rather wan figure in a heavy dark travelling coat and felt toque, her sweet lips parted and a look of bewildered amazement upon her countenance as I burst in so suddenly upon her. In silence I grasped her tiny black-gloved hand, and then, also in silence, raised it passionately to my eager lips. Her soft dark eyes, those eyes that spoke although she was mute, met mine, and in them was a look that I had never seen there before, a look which as plainly as any words told me that my wild, fevered passion was reciprocated. She gazed beyond into the room where the others had assembled, and then looked at me inquiringly, whereupon I led her forward to where they were, and Muriel fell upon her and kissed her with tears streaming from her eyes. "I've prepared this surprise for you, Mr. Gregg," Muriel said, laughing through her tears of joy. "Olinto learned that she was on her way to London, and I sent him to meet her. The Princess has managed magnificently, has she not?" "Yes, thank God she is free!" I exclaimed. "But we must induce her to tell us everything." Muriel was already helping my love out of her heavy Russian coat, a costly garment lined with sable, and when, after greeting Jack and Olinto, she was comfortably seated, I took some notepaper from the little writing table by the window and scribbled in pencil the words: "I need not write how delighted I am that you are safe, that the Almighty has heard my prayers for you. Jack and Muriel have told me all about Leithcourt and his scoundrelly associates. I know too, dear, for I may call you that, may I not? How terribly you must have suffered in silence through it all. Leithcourt is dead. He sank the yacht with all the stolen property on board, but by the accident was himself engulfed." Bending and watching intently as I wrote, she drew back in horror and surprise at the words. Then I added, "We are all four determined that the guilty shall not go unpunished, and that the affliction placed upon you shall be adequately avenged. You are my own love. I am bold enough to call you so. Some strong but mysterious bond of affinity between us caused me to seek you out, and your pictured face seemed to call me to your side, although I was unaware of your peril. I was sent to you by the unseen power to extricate you from the hands of your enemies. Therefore tell us everything, all that you know, without fear, for now that we are united, no harm can assail us." She took the pencil, and holding it in her white fingers, sat staring first at us, and then looking hesitatingly at the white paper before her. Her position, amid 100 conflicting emotions, was one of extreme difficulty. It seemed as though even now she was loath to reveal to us the absolute truth. Muriel, standing behind her chair, tenderly stroked back the wealth of chestnut hair from her white brow. Her complexion was perfect, even though her face was pale and jaded, and her eyes heavy, consequent upon her long weary journey from the now frozen north. Presently, when by signs both Jack and Olinto had urged her to write, she bent suddenly, and her pencil began to run swiftly over the paper. All of us stood exchanging glances in silence, neither looking over her, but each determined to wait in patience until the end. Once started, however, she did not pause. Sheet after sheet she covered. The silence for a long time was complete, broken only by the rapid running of the pencil over the rough surface of the paper. She had apparently become seized by a sudden determination to explain everything, now that she saw we were in real dead earnest. I watched her sweet face bent so intently, and, as the firelight fell across it, found it incomparable. Yes, she was afflicted by loss of speech, it was true, yet she was surely inexpressibly sweet and womanly, peerless above all others. With a deep-drawn sigh she at last finished, and, her head still bowed in an attitude of humiliation it seemed, she handed me what she had written to me. In breathless eagerness I read as follows: "Is it true, dear love, for I call you so in return, that you were impelled towards me by the mysterious hand that directs all things? You came in search of me, and you risked your life for mine at Caiana. Therefore you have a right to know the truth. You, as my champion, and the Princess as my friend, have contrived to effect my freedom. Were it not for you, I should ere this have been on my way to Saghalien, to the tomb to which Oberg had so ingeniously contrived to consign me. Ah, you do not know, you can never know, all that I have suffered ever since I was a girl." Here the statement broke off and recommenced as follows: "In order that you should understand the truth, I had better begin at the beginning. My father was an English merchant in Petersburg, and my mother, Vera Besanoff, who, before her marriage with my father, was celebrated at court for her beauty, and was one of the maids of honor to the Czarina. She was the only daughter of Count Paul Besanoff, ex-governor of Kharkov, and before marrying my father she had, with her mother, been a well-known figure in society. Immediately after her marriage her father died, leaving her in possession of an ample fortune, which, with my father's own wealth, placed them among the richest and most influential in Petersburg. Among my father's most intimate friends was Baron Xavier Oberg, who at that time held a very subordinate position in the Ministry of the Interior, and from my earliest recollections I can remember him coming frequently to our house and being invited to the brilliant entertainments which my mother gave. When I was 13, however, my father died of a chill contracted while boar hunting on his estates in Kiev, and within a few months a further disaster happened to us. One night, while I was sitting alone reading aloud to my mother, two strangers were announced, and on being shown in, they arrested my dear mother on a charge of complicity in a revolutionary plot against the Czar, which had been discovered at Peterhof. I stood defiant and indignant, for my mother was certainly no nihilist. Yet they said that the bomb had been introduced into the palace by the Countess Anna Shiproff, one of the ladies in waiting, who was an intimate friend of my mother's and often used to visit her. They alleged that the conspiracy had been hatched in our house, color being lent to that theory by the fact that a year before a well-known Russian with whom my father had had many business dealings had been proved to be the author of the plot by which the Czar's train was blown up near Lividia. They tore my mother away from me and placed her in that gray prison van, the sight of which in the streets of Petersburg strikes terror into the heart of every Russian, for a person once in that rumbling vehicle is, as you know, lost for ever to the world. I watched her from the window being placed in that fatal conveyance, and then I think I must have fainted, for I recollect nothing more until I found myself upon the floor, with the gray dawn spreading, and all the horrible truth came back to me. My mother was gone from me for ever. In sheer desperation I went to the Ministry of the Interior and sought an interview with the Baron, who, when I told him of the disaster, appeared greatly concerned and went at once to the police department to make inquiry. Next day, however, he came to me with the news that the charge against my mother had been proved by a statement of the woman Shiproff herself, and that she had already started on her long journey to Siberia. She had been exiled to one of those dreaded Arctic settlements beyond Yakutsk, a place where it is almost eternal winter, and where the conditions of life are such that half the convicts are insane. The Baron, however, declared that, as my father's friend, it was his duty to act as guardian to me, and that as my father had been English, I ought to be put in an English school. Therefore, with his self-assumed title of uncle, he took me to Chichester. For years I remained there, until one day he came suddenly and fetched me away, taking me over to Helsingfors, for the Czar had now appointed him Governor-General to Finland. There, for the first time, he introduced me to his son Michael, a pimply-faced lieutenant of cavalry, and said in a most decisive manner that I must marry him. I naturally refused to marry a man of whom I knew so little, whereupon, finding me obdurate, he quickly altered his tactics and became kindness itself, saying that as I was young he would allow me a year in which to make up my mind. A week later, while living in the palace at Helsingfors, I overheard a conversation between the Governor-General and his son, which revealed to me a staggering truth that I had never suspected. It was Oberg himself who had denounced my mother to the Minister of the Interior, and had made those cruel, baseless charges against her. Then I discerned the reason. She being exiled, her fortune, as well as that of my father, came to me. The reason they were scheming for Michael to marry me was in order to obtain control of my money. I saw at once how helpless I was in the hands of that unscrupulous pair, and I recognized, too, sufficient of the Baron's methods as the Strangler of Finland to show me what kind of character he was beneath that calm, eminently respectable, black-coated exterior. After deliberately sending my poor mother to Siberia, he had assumed the role of my guardian, in order that he might, when I came of age, obtain control of my inheritance, the idea no doubt being that I should marry Michael, and then, after the necessary legal formalities, I should, on a trumped-up charge of conspiracy, share the same fate as my mother had done. "The infernal scoundrel!" I ejaculated when I read her words, while from Jack, who had been looking over my shoulder, escaped a fierce and forcible vow of vengeance. The Baron took me with him to Petersburg when he went on official business, and we remained there nearly a month, the narrative went on. While there I received a secret message from the Red Priest, the unseen and unknown power of Nihilism, who has for so many years baffled the police. I went to see him, and he revealed to me how Oberg had contrived to have my mother banished upon a false charge. He warned me against the man who had pretended to be my father's friend, and also told me that he had known my father intimately, and that if I got into any further difficulty, I was to communicate with him, and he would assist me. Oberg took me back to Helsingfors a few months later, and in summer we went to England. He was a marvelously clever diplomatist. His tactics he could change at will. When I was at school he was rough and brutal in his manner towards me, as he was to all, but now he seemed to be endeavoring to inspire my confidence by treating me with kindly regard and pleasant affability. In London, at Claridge's, we met my old schoolfellow Muriel and her father, a friend of Oberg's, and in response to their invitation went for a cruise on their yacht, the Iris, from Southampton. Our party was a very pleasant one. It included Woodroffe and Chater, while our cruise across the Bay of Biscay and along the Portuguese coast proved most delightful. One night, while we were lying outside Lisbon, Woodroffe and Chater, together with Olinto, went ashore, and when they returned in the early hours of the morning, they awoke me by crossing the deck above my head. Then I heard someone outside my cabin door, as though with a screwdriver unscrewing a screw from the woodwork. This aroused my interest, and next day I made a minute examination of the panelling, where in one part I found 2 small brass screws that had evidently been recently removed. Therefore I succeeded in getting hold of a screwdriver from the carpenter's shop, and next night, when everyone was asleep, I crept out and unscrewed the panel, when, to my surprise, I saw that the secret cavity behind was filled with beautiful jewelry, diamond collars, tiaras, necklets, fine pearls, emeralds and turquoises, all thrown in indiscriminately. I replaced the panel and kept careful watch. At Marseilles, where we called, more jewelry and a heavy bagful of plate was brought aboard and secreted behind another panel. Then I knew that the men were thieves. But surely, continued the strange story my mute love had written, I need not describe all that occurred upon that eventful voyage, except to tell you of one very curious incident which occurred. I had spoken confidentially with Muriel regarding my suspicions of the men who were our fellow guests, and when in secret I showed her several places on board the yacht where valuables were secreted, she also became convinced that the men were expert thieves to whom her father, for some unexplained reason, rendered assistance and asylum. She told me that since she had left school she had been on quite a number of cruises, and that the same party always accompanied my father. She had, however, never suspected the truth until I pointed it out to her. Well, one hot summer's night we were lying off Naples, and as it was a grand festa ashore, and there was to be a gala performance at the theatre, Leithcourt took a box and the whole party were rowed ashore. The crew were also given shore leave for the evening, but as the great heat had upset me, I declined to accompany the theatre party, and remained on board with one sailor named Wilson to constitute the watch. We had anchored about half a mile from land, and earlier in the evening the Baron had gone ashore to send telegrams to Russia and had not returned. About 10 o'clock I went below to try and sleep, but I had a slight attack of fever and was unable. Therefore I redressed and sat with the light still out, gazing across the starlit bay. Presently from my porthole I saw a shore boat approaching, and recognized in it the Baron with a well-dressed stranger. They both came on board, and the boatman, having been paid, pulled back to the shore. Then the Baron and his friend, a dark, middle-aged, full-bearded man, evidently a person of refinement, went below to the saloon, and after a few moments called to the man Wilson, who was on the watch, and gave him a glass of whisky and water, which he took up to the deck to drink at his leisure. The unusual character of my fellow guests on board that craft was such that my suspicion was constantly on the alert. Therefore curiosity tempted me to creep along and peep in at the crack of the door standing ajar. A closer view revealed the fact that the stranger was a high Russian official to whom I had once been introduced at the Government Palace at Helsingfors, the Privy Councillor and Senator Paul Polovstov. They were smoking together and were discussing in Russian the means by which he, Polovstov, had arranged to obtain plans of some new British fortifications at Gibraltar. From what he said, it seemed that some Russian woman, married to an Englishman, a captain in the garrison, had been impressed into the Secret Service against her will, but that she had, in order to save herself, promised to obtain the photographs and plans that were required. I heard the Englishman's name, and I resolved to take some steps to inform him in secret of the intentions of the Russian agent. Presently the two men took fresh cigars, ascended on deck, and cast themselves in the long cane chairs amidships. Still all curiosity to hear further details on the ingenious piece of espionage against my own nation, I took off my shoes and crept up to a spot where I could crouch concealed and overhear their conversation, for the Italian night was calm and still. They talked mainly about affairs in Finland, and with some of Oberg's expressions of opinion, Polovstov ventured to differ. This aroused the Baron's anger, and I knew from the cold sarcasm of his remarks and the peculiarly hard tone of his voice that he was more incensed than he outwardly showed himself to be. He rose and stood with his back to the bulwarks facing his friend, who still sat leaning back in his deck chair, insisting upon his own views. He was quite calm, and not in the least perturbed by the evil glint in the Baron's eye. Perhaps he did not know him so well as I did. He did not know what that look meant. Suddenly, while the Privy Councillor lay back in his chair, pulling thoughtfully at his cigar, there was a bright, blood-red flash, a dull report, and a man's short, agonized cry. Startled, I leaned around the corner of the deck-house, when, to my abject horror, I saw under the electric rays the Czar's Privy Councillor lying sideways in his chair with part of his face blown away. Then the hideous truth in an instant became apparent. The cigar which Oberg had pressed upon him down in the saloon had exploded, and the small missile concealed inside the diabolical contrivance had passed upwards into his brain. For a moment I stood utterly stupefied, yet as I looked I saw the Baron, in a paroxysm of rage, shake his fist in the dead man's face and cry with a fearful imprecation, "You hound! You have plotted to replace me in the Czar's favour! You intended to become Governor-General of Finland! You knew certain facts which you intended to put before his Majesty, knowing that the revelations would result in my disgrace and downfall! But, you infernal cur, you did not know that those who attempt to thwart Xavier Oberg either die by accident or go for life to Cayana or to the mines." And he spurned the body with his foot and laughed to himself as he gloated over his dastardly crime. I watched his rage, unable to utter a single word. I saw him, after he had searched the dead man's pockets, raise the inert body with its awful, featureless face and drag it to the bulwarks. Then I rushed forward and faced him. In an instant he sprang at me and I screamed. But no aid came. The man Wilson was sleeping soundly in the bows, for the whisky he had given him had been doctored, went on the narrative. Upon his face was a fierce, murderous look such as I had never seen before. "You!" he screamed, his dark eyes starting from their sockets as he realized that I had been a witness of his cowardly crime. "You have spied upon me, girl," he hissed, "and you shall die also." I sank upon my knees, imploring him to spare me, but he only laughed at my entreaty. "See," he cried, "as you saw how he enjoyed his cigar, you may as well see this." And with an effort he raised the dead body in his arms, poised it for a moment on the vessel's side, and then, with a hoarse laugh of triumph, heaved it into the sea. There was a splash, and then we were alone. "And you," he cried in a fierce voice, "you who have spied upon me, you will follow. The water there will close your chattering mouth." I shrieked, begged and implored, but his trembling hands were upon my throat. First he dragged me to my feet, then he threw me upon my knees, and at last, with that grim brutality which characterizes him, he directed me to go and get a mop and bucket from the forecastle and remove the dark red stains from the chair and deck. This he actually forced me to do, gloating over my horror as I removed for him the traces of his cowardly crime. Then, with his hand upon my shoulder, he said, "Girl, recollect that you keep to-night's work secret. If not, you shall die a death more painful than that dog has died, one in which you shall experience all the tortures of the damned. Recollect, not a single word, or death. Now go to your cabin and never pry into my affairs again." I went back to my cabin, as I was bid, and sat speechless in abject horror. The fiendish actions of the man who was my guardian frightened me. And yet I was utterly helpless. What could I do? Who in holy Russia would hear me? Oberg was a power in the Empire. The Czar himself trusted him. If I spoke, who would believe me? Who would heed the words of a defenseless girl whom he would at once declare to be hysterical? Thus I waited alone in the darkness, watching the lights of the port gleaming across the placid waters until nearly 1 o'clock, when the gay party returned, and the Baron greeted them merrily as though nothing had happened. But my heart was frozen within me by the recollection of the awful crime that had been committed. "Why, now I remember!" cried Muriel, amazed. "I remember that night quite well. How white you were when you came to my cabin and asked to be allowed to sleep in my spare berth. You would tell me nothing, and only said that you were ill. None of us had any idea that such a terrible tragedy had been enacted. But of course the Baron had arranged it all, for it was at his instigation, I recollect, that the crew had been given shore leave. Mackintosh suggested that only half the crew should go, but he declared that if Wilson alone were left, it would be sufficient." "I, too, recollect the affair quite well," Jack declared, tugging at his moustache, utterly amazed at my love's strange story. It was a plain statement of hard, astounding facts, and she now stood clinging to me, looking eagerly into my eyes, reading every thought that passed through my mind. A great sensation was caused when the body was discovered. The squadron was lying off Naples about a week after the Iris had left, and while we were there the body was washed up near Sorrento. At first but little notice was taken of it, but by the marks on the dead man's linen it was discovered that he was Polovstov, one of the highest Russian officials who had, it was said, been warned on several occasions by the Nihilists. It was therefore concluded that his death had been due to Nihilist vengeance. Elma pointed to the paper, and made a sign that I was to read on. This I did, and the statement ran as follows. The real reason why the Baron spared my life was because if I died, my fortune would pass to a distant cousin living at Durham. Yet his manner towards me was now most polite and pleasant, a change that I felt boded no good. He intended to obtain my money by marrying me to his son Michael, whose evil reputation as a gambler was well known in Petersburg. We travelled back to Finland in the autumn, and in the winter he took me to stay with his sister in Nice. Yet almost daily he referred to that tragedy at Naples, and threatened me with death if ever I uttered a single word or even admitted that I had ever seen the man who was his rival and his victim. Last June commenced another paragraph. We were in Helsingfors, when one day the Baron called me suddenly and told me to prepare for a journey. We were to cross to Stockholm and thence to Hull, where the Iris was awaiting us, for Mr. Leithcourt and Muriel had invited us for a summer cruise to the Greek islands. We boarded the yacht much against my will, yet I was powerless, and dare not allege the facts that I had already established concerning our fellow guests. Muriel and I, it seems, were taken merely in order to blind the shore guards and customs officials as to the real nature of the vessel, which, when safely out of the Channel, was repainted and renamed the Lola, and her exterior presented quite a different appearance from the Iris. The port of Leghorn was our first place of call, and for some reason we ran purposely upon a sandbank and were towed off by Italian torpedo boats. Next evening you came on board and dined, Muriel and myself having strict orders not to show ourselves. We, however, watched you, and I saw you pick up my photograph which I had that day torn up. Then, immediately after you had left, Woodroffe, Chater and Mackintosh went ashore and were away a couple of hours in the middle of the night. Just before they returned, the Baron rapped at the door of my cabin, saying that he must go ashore, and telling me to dress and accompany him. He would never allow me the luxury of a maid, fearing, I suppose, that she might learn too much. In obedience I rose and dressed, and when I went forth he told me to get my travelling cloak and dressing bag, adding that he was compelled to go north, as to continue the cruise would occupy too much time. He was due back at his official duties, he said. As soon as I had finished packing, the three men returned to the vessel, all of them looking dark-faced and disappointed. Woodroffe whispered some words to the Baron, after which I went to Muriel's cabin and wished her good-bye, and we went ashore, taking the train first to Colle Salvetti, thence to Pisa, and afterwards to the beautiful old city of Siena, which I had so longed to see. One of my teeth gave me pain, and the Baron, after a couple of days at the Hôtel de Sienne, took me to a queer-looking little old Italian, a dentist who, he said, enjoyed an excellent reputation. I was quick to notice that the two men had met before, and as I sat in the chair and gas was given to me, I saw them exchange meaning glances. In a few moments I became insensible, but when I awoke an hour later, I was astounded to feel a curious soreness in my ears. My tongue, too, seemed paralyzed, and in a few moments the awful truth dawned upon me. I had been rendered deaf and dumb. The Baron pretended to be greatly concerned about me, it went on, but I quickly realized that I had been the victim of a foul and dastardly plot, and that he had conceived it, fearing lest I might speak the truth concerning the Privy Councillor Polovtsov, for of exposure he lived in constant fear. To encompass my end would be against his own interests, as he would lose my fortune, so he had silenced me lest I should reveal the terrible truth concerning both him and his associates. He was not rich, and I have reason to believe that from time to time he gave information as to persons who possessed valuable jewels, and thus shared in the plunder obtained by those on the yacht. From Italy we travelled on to Berlin, thence to Petersburg, and back to dreary Helsingfors, journeying as quickly as we could, yet never allowing me opportunity of being with strangers. Both my ears and tongue were very painful, but I said nothing. He was surely a fiend in a black coat, and my only thought now was how to escape him. From the moment when that so-called dentist had ruined my hearing and deprived me of power of speech, he kept me aloof from everyone. The fear that I should reveal everything had apparently grown to haunt him, and he had conceived that terrible mode of silencing my lips. But the true depth of his villainy was not yet apparent until I was back in Finland. On the night of our arrival he called in his son, who had travelled with us from Petersburg, and in writing again demanded that I should marry him. I wrote my reply, a firm refusal. He struck the table angrily with his fist and wrote saying that I should either marry his son or die. The next day, while walking alone out beyond the town of Helsingfors, as I often used to do, I was arrested upon the false charge of an attempt upon the life of Madame Vakuroff, and transported without trial to the terrible fortress of Kajana, some of the horrors of which you have yourself experienced. The charge against me was necessary before I could be incarcerated there, but once within, it was the scheme of the Governor-General to obtain my consent to the marriage by threats and by the constant terrors of the place. He even went so far as to obtain a ministerial order for my banishment to Sakhalin, and brought it to me to Kajana, declaring that if in 1 month I did not consent, he should allow me to be sent to exile. While I was in Kajana he knew that his secret was safe, therefore by every means in his power he urged me to consent to the odious union. All the rest is known to you, how Providence directed you to me as my deliverer, and how Woodroffe followed you in secret, and pretending to be my friend, took me with him to Petersburg. He had learned of my fortune from the Baron, and intended to marry me himself. But now that it is all over, it appears to me like some terrible dream. I never believed that so much iniquity existed in the world, or that men could fight a defenseless woman with such double-dealing and cruel ingenuity. Ah, the tortures I endured in Kajana are beyond human conception. Yet surely Oberg and Woodroffe will obtain their well-merited deserts, if not in this world, then in the world to come. Are we not taught by Holy Writ to forgive our enemies? Therefore, let us forgive. There my silent love's strange story ended. A bald, straightforward narrative that held us all for some moments absolutely speechless. One of the strongest and most startling stories ever revealed. She watched every expression of my countenance, and then, when I had finished reading and placed my arm tenderly about her slim waist, she raised her beautiful face to mine to receive the passionate kiss I imprinted upon those soft, full lips. "This, of course, makes everything plain," exclaimed Jack. "Polovtsov was a very liberal-minded and upright official who was greatly in the favour of the Czar, and a serious rival to Oberg, whose drastic and merciless methods in Finland were not exactly approved by the Emperor. The Baron was well aware of this, and by ingeniously enticing him on board the Iris, he succeeded by handing that small bomb concealed in a cigar, a Nihilist contrivance that had probably been seized by his police in Finland, in freeing himself from the rival who was destined to occupy his post. "Yes," I said with a sigh. "The mystery is cleared up. It is true, yet my poor Elma is still the victim." And I kissed my love passionately again and again upon the lips. End of chapter 18. Conclusion. Nearly 2 years have now gone by. There have been changes in Holy Russia, many great and amazing changes consequent upon war and its disasters. Russia is no longer the great power that she was once supposed to be. Many events that have startled the world have occurred since that day when I first enfolded my silent love within my arms. One of them is known to you all. You read in the newspapers, without a doubt, how the Baron Xavier Oberg, the persecutor of Finland, the enemy of education, the relentless foe of the defenseless, the man who ordered women to be knouted to death in Kajana, the heartless official whom the Finns called the Strangler, was blown to pieces by a bomb thrown beneath his carriage as he drove to the railway station in Helsingfors on his way to have audience with the Emperor. The secret truth was that the Red Priest decreed that Oberg should die, and the plot was swiftly put into execution, and although 500 arrests were made, the police are unaware to this day of the identity of the person who directed it, or of who threw the fatal missile. From pillar to post, the revolutionists have been hunted by the bloodhounds of police, yet the Red Priest still lives on quietly in Petersburg, and the Princess Zurloff, still unsuspected, devotes the greater part of her enormous income to the cause of freedom. Of Jack and Muriel I need only say that they were married about 3 months after Elma's return from Russia, and at the present time they are living on the outskirts of Glasgow, where Jack has secured the shore appointment which he so long coveted. By some means, exactly how is not quite certain, the police discovered that Dick Archer, alias Woodroffe, alias Hornby, was concerned in the clever robbery of a dressing bag containing the Dowager Lady Lancashire's jewels from her footman on Euston platform, and after a long search they found him hiding at a hotel in Liverpool. When, however, they went to arrest him, he laughed in the faces of the detectives, placed something swiftly in his mouth, and swallowed it before they could prevent him. Then 10 minutes later he fell dead. He knew what terrible revelations must be made if we gave evidence against him, and he therefore preferred death by his own hand to that following a judicial sentence. Chater, although one of the most expert jewel thieves in Europe, had never been actually guilty of any graver offense, and when we heard that he was in San Francisco, where he had opened a small bar and was trying to live honestly, we resolved to allow him to remain there. Indeed, Jack wrote to him about 9 months ago, warning him never to set foot on English soil again on pain of arrest. Olinto Santini has recently opened a small restaurant in Western Road, Brighton, and is, I believe, doing very well. And ourselves? Well, what can I really tell you? Mere words fail to tell you of the completeness of our happiness. It is idyllic, that is all I can say. My proposal of marriage was made to Elma a very few days after she wrote down her startling and romantic story, and a year ago, at a little village church in Hertfordshire, we became man and wife, there being present at our wedding Madam Heath, my bride's mother, to whom by my exertions in official quarters in Petersburg the Czar's clemency was extended, and she was released from that far-off Arctic prison to which she had been sent with such cruel injustice. 2 of the greatest London specialists have continually treated my dear wife, and under them she has already recovered her speech, so far indeed that she can now whisper in a low, soft voice. But, they tell me, they are hopeful that ere long her voice will become stronger and speech practically restored. Already, too, she can begin to hear. After all the storms and perils of the past, our lives are now indeed full of a calm, sweet peace. In our own comfortable little house, with its trellised porch covered with roses and honeysuckle, that faces the blue channel at St. Margaret's Bay beyond Dover, we lead a life of mutual trust and boundless love. We are supremely content, the happiest pair in the world, we think. Often, as we sit together at evening, gazing out upon the great ships passing darkly away into the mysterious afterglow, our hands clasp mutually in a silence more eloquent than words, and as we gaze into each other's eyes, there occurs to us the divine injunction, "Whom God hath joined, let no man put asunder." End of conclusion. End of The Czar's Spy by William le Queux.